The story begins with the hero being defeated by the Demon King. Humanity, cornered, gathered 1,000 barrier mages to counter the Demon King and his army. They created a barrier against the demon realm, and during that time, generations of heroes challenged the Demon King, but they kept losing. 30 years later, in the mountains, our protagonist Blake, a 39-year-old barrier mage, woke up and stretched his hands. After putting on a coat, he stepped out of his hut and remarked to himself that he still felt energetic today. He looked at the swarm of demons outside the barrier he had created. He noticed that the barrier was getting weaker. Kneeling down, he placed both hands on the ground and began to cast a spell to reinforce the barrier. He poured all his energy into thickening it, but observed that the barrier's effectiveness had been weakening faster lately, and the required magical power had increased significantly. Blake hoped that a new hero would soon defeat the Demon King. Meanwhile, in the Demon King's castle, the hero faced the Demon King. They dashed toward each other and launched their attacks simultaneously. The hero screamed loudly while swinging her sword. Along with her attack, she unleashed her power and managed to slash the Demon King while dodging his attack. The Demon King was severely injured, coughing up blood, and could not believe he had lost. He repeatedly muttered that it was unforgivable and tried to say something to the hero, but he died before he could finish. The hero smiled victoriously, raised her sword, and declared their triumph, urging everyone to celebrate. A strong blue light emerged from the Demon King's castle, which Blake noticed. He was shocked and wondered what it was. He then saw the demons outside the barrier collapse and slowly vanish. Blake guessed that the heroes had defeated the Demon King. He also noticed the miasma disappearing and was amazed, realizing that it was true. Blake was glad that the miasma and monsters from the demon realm were vanishing, bringing peace to the world. Knowing that everyone could now live without worry, he reflected on maintaining the barrier for 30 years and wondered if there would be some reward. 1 month later, men appeared at his hut. One of them shouted that he was no longer needed. Confused, Blake asked what they meant. The man accused him of wasting public funds on a useless barrier and called him a money-grubbing fraud. Blake explained that he had been maintaining the barrier to prevent miasma and monsters from escaping the demon realm. But the man pretended not to know anything about it and mocked him, asking what an incompetent, bottom-tier barrier mage could possibly do. Another man kicked Blake out of his hut, shouting that the shabby hut and land belonged to the country. Feeling hopeless, Blake walked away, saddened that his 30 years of hard work had come to this. He decided he had no choice but to return to the village where he had lived as a child. A short time later, Blake arrived at the Adventurers Guild in Hatno Village and was surprised to see a few gold coins on the table. He told the guild receptionist that the reward was too small, but the old lady grew angry and shouted at him not to complain. Blake knew he couldn't survive on such a small amount and felt disheartened, wondering if the barrier had really been useless after all. The next day, Blake was forced to work at the guild despite the low pay, as he had no other job options as a barrier mage. He begged the receptionist for work, telling her he didn't mind if the pay was low. However, the old lady replied that there was no work left for him because no one requested barrier mages anymore. The man behind him teased that he should try weeding or other odd jobs, but another man mockingly added that even those jobs wouldn't need a barrier mage. They laughed at him as Blake stood there, dejected. Blake remained silent while the men laughed at him, but suddenly someone knocked on the guild door. A knight barged inside and asked if there was a barrier mage named Blake present. The receptionist was shocked to see royal knights, and the men questioned why they were in such a rural area, speculating if the incompetent barrier mage had done something wrong. Blake immediately raised his hand and told the captain that he was the barrier mage. Blake. The captain stared at him for a moment while approaching, making Blake uneasy. The knight then informed him that they had come on Hero Alice's orders and were heading to the royal capital, asking if Blake would be willing to accompany them. The men who had been mocking Blake were stunned upon hearing that he was summoned by the hero and invited to the royal capital. They questioned how an incompetent barrier mage could achieve such recognition. Blake replied to the captain that he understood, and the captain apologized for the urgency, explaining that they needed to depart immediately. Pointing to the carriage outside, the captain instructed Blake to board it. As Blake approached the carriage, the men began panicking, asking the old receptionist if Blake really was just a barrier mage, worried they might face punishment for their behavior. The old woman stuttered, suggesting they should apologize. Once Blake entered the carriage, their journey began. He found the ride surprisingly comfortable but felt out of place, unable to believe he had been summoned by the hero. He recalled helping her once before and wondered if she remembered him. Hours later, they arrived at the Hendira Kingdom's royal capital, Miston. Looking out the window, Blake marveled at the sheer size of the city, having never seen so many people before. The carriage rode straight to the castle. Upon arrival, he followed the knight captain inside, feeling increasingly out of place. Suddenly, a sweet voice greeted him, saying, "You've come," and he turned to see Hero Alice, an 18-year-old with a warm smile. She told him she had been waiting for him and asked if he remembered her. When Blake replied that he did, she became excited, expressing how glad she was. Alice thanked Blake for saving her when she was separated from her companions near the demon realm. She explained that she had thought it was the end for her until he helped her. Blake awkwardly replied that he didn't do much and had simply assisted her companions as well. Alice apologized that her companions couldn't meet him as they were busy with ceremonies, then excitedly asked about his plans now that his barrier work was finished, speculating that someone like him must be in high demand. Blake laughed awkwardly, admitting that nothing was decided yet, though the truth was that he was unemployed. Alice, beaming with enthusiasm, suggested he join the Royal Magician Corps, shocking everyone and angering one of the members. Gunther, the 22-year-old vice captain of the 5th Division of the Royal Magician Corps, protested. He explained that the Royal Magician Corps was an elite unit and barrier mages were unqualified to join. He told Alice not to lump incompetent barrier mages together with magicians. Alice defended Blake, reminding Gunther that barrier mages had maintained the barrier that suppressed miasma and monsters from the demon realm. Gunther dismissed her argument, arrogantly claiming that monsters feared magicians, not barriers, and that miasma could easily be dealt with using magic. He concluded that barrier mages were unnecessary. Blake silently clenched his fists in anger, recalling how barrier mages had been respected 30 years ago. He couldn't believe their reputation had fallen so much in that time. Gunther mockingly called Blake an old man and suggested that only young, promising individuals were suited for such jobs. He then told Alice that Blake had no skills and shouldn't be considered unless he could prove otherwise. Alice asked Gunther if he was saying Blake should prove himself by defeating him. Gunther confidently replied that if Blake had enough skill to beat him, then it would be fine. Alice told Blake that she believed he could win, boosting his confidence. Blake hesitated but ultimately agreed. Shortly after, they stood on an outdoor stage. Blake faced Gunther, who wore a mocking smile. Blake wondered how things had escalated to this when he had only come because he was summoned. Gunther introduced himself as the vice captain of the 5th Division of the Royal Magicians. He began gathering fire magic in his hand, warning Blake not to complain if he died. Gunther then aimed and unleashed the fireball directly at Blake. Gunther's attack caused a strong explosion, and the magicians assumed it was over, praising their vice captain's power. Gunther arrogantly laughed, saying this was what happened when a mere barrier mage got cocky. However, his laughter was interrupted, making him irritated. He demanded to know who was disrupting his moment of victory, only to hear a voice ask, "Has the exam started yet?" Gunther and everyone else were shocked to see Blake standing unscathed. Gunther stared in disbelief, wondering how it was possible since he had cast the spell with the intent to burn him to ashes. He couldn't fathom what Blake had done. Frustrated, Gunther cast another fire spell, declaring that he had gone too easy on him and would now get serious. Mockingly, he shouted for Blake to just take it, as he released a stronger fire magic attack. Blake calmly raised a barrier, protecting himself once more. Gunther's attack exploded upon impact, but he didn't stop, hurling a swarm of fireballs at Blake while shouting for him to burn to ashes. The young magicians watching grew worried, thinking that no one could survive such magic. However, Blake, who was effortlessly blocking the attacks with his barrier, found the magic too weak. He wondered if Gunther was still holding back because the power didn't add up. After an onslaught of attacks, Gunther covered his nose from the smoke and smugly asked if Blake was finally dead. But as the smoke cleared, he froze in shock. Blake was still standing in the same spot without a scratch. Gunther shouted in disbelief, demanding to know how Blake was still alive. Blake turned to face Gunther, who was muttering to himself that this was impossible. Gunther, in a mocking tone, taunted Blake, calling him trash who could only create barriers. He sneered that defending was meaningless if Blake couldn't attack, urging him to try striking back if he was so frustrated. Blake, confused for a moment, raised his hand and calmly said he would do just that. Gunther, equally confused, asked what Blake had just said. Suddenly, a small but powerful barrier shot from Blake's hand, slamming into Gunther's face. The force sent Gunther rolling across the ground until he crashed into a wall. The magicians gasped in disbelief that their vice captain had been blown away. Gunther stood up, cursing, and demanded to know what Blake had done, insisting that barrier mages couldn't attack. Blake simply replied that he had moved the barrier and demonstrated the technique. Gunther shouted in outrage, claiming that barriers were meant to be stationary and moving them made no sense. Blake awkwardly explained that after 30 years of setting up barriers, he had gotten the hang of it, jokingly asking if it counted as cheating. The magicians began whispering among themselves, questioning if the barrier mage was actually stronger than the vice captain. They noted that Blake had taken all the attacks without a single scratch. Hearing their whispers, Gunther grew enraged, wondering how he could lose to trash. Realizing his position was slipping, he glanced at his team, who silently nodded back at him. They cast a spell to create a small fireball behind Blake. The fireball grew larger and attempted to burn him from behind, but Blake's shield activated automatically, protecting him. The crowd was stunned, but Alice smiled knowingly. Blake, oblivious, turned and asked if something had hit him, wondering if it was a stone. Gunther, watching in disbelief, realized the barrier activated on its own. "What the hell is this guy?" he muttered. Alice stared at Blake, a glimmer of pride in her eyes, thinking that Blake had proven his strength. Furious, Gunther prepared another spell. He couldn't accept ending the duel in such humiliation. Pouring all his mana into a final attack, he prepared to release an advanced fire magic spell. The young magicians, sensing the danger, fled. knowing they would be caught in the blast. Gunther shouted at Blake, declaring that he would kill him with this full-power attack, and unleashed a massive fire cannonball. Blake didn't even move as the enormous spell barreled toward him. The magicians behind him screamed in fear, but Alice remained calm. She knew advanced magic couldn't be blocked by an ordinary barrier, but she believed in Blake. As one time when they surrounded by demon, he had killed demons by simply moving his barriers. As she expected, Blake effortlessly nullified the fire cannonball, leaving Gunther in stunned disbelief. Gunther fell to his knees, repeatedly muttering that it was impossible. His strongest magic had failed, and his mana was completely depleted. The crowd murmured in awe, realizing that Blake had won. Alice proudly announced that Blake had proven himself and declared that the Barrier Mage squad had triumphed. She insisted Blake was qualified to join the Royal Magician Corps. Gunther tried to argue, shouting that Blake wasn't the only Barrier Mage. He demanded to know what had happened to the others. Investigators arrived, reporting that most of the other Barrier Mages had either died or abandoned their duties, embezzling funds in the process. Gradually, they had disappeared, leaving Blake as the sole Barrier Mage maintaining the vast barrier around the demon realm. Blake understood, realizing why his mana for setting up barriers kept increasing. Gunther, stunned, shouted at the investigator, questioning how Blake alone could manage a barrier over an area larger than the entire kingdom of Hendria. He pressed further, asking the investigator if his saying Blake maintaining a barrier that scale by himself. Alice smiled, realizing Blake had exceeded all expectations. Suddenly, a voice interrupted the commotion. A figure entered the scene, demanding to know what was going on. Gunther froze in shock. It was Lancelot, the captain of the 1st Division. Everyone was amazed to see Lancelot, the top captain of the 1st Division, as it was their first time seeing him up close. Lancelot ordered Gunther to explain what was going on. Before Gunther could respond, Alice appeared next to Lancelot and explained that she had recommended Blake, the Barrier Mage, to join the Royal Magician Corps. However, Gunther had doubted Blake's abilities, leading to a practical test. Lancelot asked Alice to confirm if this meant they had conducted a duel, and she replied affirmatively. Gunther angrily glared at Blake, but Blake remained calm. Lancelot then turned to Gunther and remarked that it appeared he had lost. Gunther, flustered, tried to excuse himself by claiming he had gone easy on Blake, insisting it wouldn't have been appropriate to go all out against a mere barrier mage. Lancelot firmly cut him off, stating that he had heard enough of his pathetic excuses. Gunther's frustration was evident, but he didn't dare talk back in fear of Lancelot's authority. Lancelot approached Blake and said that regardless of one's title, if they had the skills, they would be allowed to join. He officially declared Blake a member of the Royal Magician Corps, much to Blake's surprise. The other magicians were equally stunned that Lancelot was allowing a barrier mage into the elite corps, but having witnessed Blake defeat the 5th Division vice captain, they had no objections. Blake smiled in disbelief, wondering if someone like him, who had spent 30 years maintaining barriers, could truly belong in the kingdom's top magician corps. Alice then stepped forward, smiling brightly, and congratulated him. She sweetly told him that she had always believed in him. Blake thanked her, saying it was all thanks to her. Alice brushed it off, suggesting they go out to celebrate instead. Before they could leave, Lancelot appeared behind Alice and sternly asked if she thought she had time for celebrations. Alice sighed in frustration as the magicians grabbed her, and Lancelot reminded her that they needed to get back to work. She resisted, calling out to Blake for help, but they dragged her away despite her protests. Afterward, Lancelot turned to Blake and remarked that Alice seemed to favor him. He asked what kind of relationship Blake had with her. Blake calmly replied that they were merely acquaintances. Lancelot nodded but warned him that many people tried to get close to the hero for ulterior motives, cautioning Blake not to be one of them. With that, Lancelot walked away, while Gunther glared at Blake with pure hatred. A few days later, Blake arrived at the Royal Magician Corps dormitory. He was surprised by the size and grandeur of the building. Upon entering, he looked around nervously, searching for his assigned room. As he wandered, a group of young women noticed him and began whispering among themselves. They wondered why an older man was in the dormitory, noting that he didn't look like a superior officer. His shabby clothes made them suspect he was a commoner. Feeling awkward under their stares, Blake quickly walked away, deciding to find his room as soon as possible. After a few minutes, he located room 206, the room assigned to him. He knocked on the door and opened it, excusing himself as he entered. Inside, a young trainee of the Royal Magician Corps, 16-year-old Sven, turned to face him and asked bluntly, "Who are you?" Blake greeted Sven and introduced himself as his new roommate, starting today. Sven immediately asked, "Why is there an old guy here?" After Blake explained everything, Sven shouted in disbelief, asking if Blake was claiming that he had been recommended by the hero and had defeated Vice Captain Gunther to join the Royal Magician Corps. Sven then shouted at him not to lie, prompting Blake to realize that from an objective perspective, it did sound unbelievable. Sven began shaking, making Blake worriedly ask if he was all right. Sven then shouted that his life in the Corps was over because an old liar guy was on the same team as him. Confused, Blake asked what he meant by same team. Sven explained that roommates were placed on the same team in the new trainee division. Blake nodded in understanding and apologized for being an old man, but assured Sven that he would do his best not to hold him back. Feeling guilty, Sven stuttered that it wasn't entirely Blake's fault. Sven suddenly stopped and noticed Blake's hair, commenting that it was a mess and would get in the way during training. He asked if Blake wanted him to cut it for him. Minutes later, Sven finished cutting Blake's hair and asked how it was. Blake thanked him, saying he felt refreshed. Suddenly, Sven snapped, realizing it was almost time for training. He hurriedly told Blake to change into his uniform, to which Blake quickly agreed. A moment later, they met Therese and Clara, two 16-year-old trainees of the Royal Magician Corps. Therese asked Sven who the old guy was, and Clara mentioned that she had never seen him before. Sven replied that Blake was apparently on their team, and Blake greeted them. Therese was shocked and shouted, asking why an old man was on their team and if it wasn't strange to have him as a new recruit. Clara tried to calm her down, saying she was going too far, but Therese retorted that Clara was probably thinking the same thing. Blake heard their comments but remained calm, acknowledging that all the other recruits were young and that he was the only older person there. Shortly after, a senior officer introduced Blake to the group, announcing that he had just joined. Blake introduced himself as a barrier mage and greeted everyone. The other trainees began whispering, speculating if he was the one rumored to have defeated Vice Captain Gunther. Most doubted the story, thinking there was no way it could be true. Clara and Therese were skeptical, struggling to believe it, while Sven panicked, thinking their team was doomed because Blake was a barrier mage and therefore, in his opinion, weak. From the side, Gunther glared at Blake with hatred, vowing silently that Blake wouldn't get away with embarrassing him. The senior addressed the group, explaining that they were the newest recruits and their divisions hadn't been decided yet. Their performance during training would determine their placements. Blake realized this meant they weren't officially enlisted yet and resolved to work hard and show results. The senior then announced that for their first task, they would conduct a survival exercise. The trainees were instructed to hunt monsters in the Mecha Forest, with points awarded based on their performance. They had 2 weeks to complete the exercise. The announcement caused panic among the trainees, as they all knew that the Mecha Forest was infamous for its miasma pools. The senior, seemingly unconcerned, remarked that it was just bad luck for them and ordered everyone to grab their equipment and depart. Blake picked up his gear, while Sven, terrified, kept muttering that it was over, knowing that the Mecha Forest was no place for rookies. Sven then turned to Blake, begging him not to hold the team back. Blake calmly reassured him that he understood. The senior ordered everyone to board dragon carriages by team, as they would be transported to their respective starting points in the forest. Everyone climbed into their carriages, unaware that Gunther was secretly plotting to make Blake's life hell during the exercise. After hours of traveling, they arrived at the forest. Sven was stunned with horror when he saw the place and shouted, asking what kind of hellish place it was. Sven asked why they had started from a mountaintop far from the forest. Clara observed that it seemed there were no other teams nearby, prompting Therese to ask if they had drawn the short straw. Sven shouted in despair that it was over and that they were totally screwed. He added that he had dreamed of joining the Royal Magician Corps, but this was what he got instead. Therese snapped at Sven, calling him pathetic and reminding him that, as the team leader, he should at least say, "Follow me," or something encouraging. Sven angrily shouted back for her to shut up, complaining that he had only been appointed team leader out of nowhere. Blake excused himself from their argument, causing Sven and Therese to turn to him in irritation and ask what he wanted. Blake calmly suggested that they look at the map and figure out where they were. He added that he'd like to know their exact location. Sven and Therese exchanged silent glances before Sven reluctantly opened the map. He pointed out their current position. Clara commented that it was quite far from their target, but they might make it if they hurried. Therese, however, questioned if it was even possible unless they rushed the whole way. Blake asked if they should leave immediately, and Sven begrudgingly agreed, saying they had no choice. Therese sighed in frustration, but told the group to steel themselves for the journey. They began descending the mountaintop and continued walking for hours. Sven grumbled that the luggage was too heavy, making it difficult to walk. Therese, visibly tired, stuttered while asking if they were still not at Mecha Forest yet. Clara glanced at Blake and noticed that, unlike the rest of them, the older man wasn't even breaking a sweat. She silently wondered if Blake was used to such strenuous travel. Hours passed, and night had fallen by the time they arrived at Mecha Forest. Sven immediately noticed the intense miasma in the air, and Therese agreed, noting that a normal person without resistance would die instantly upon entering. Clara reassured them that as magicians, they should be fine with that level of miasma. Therese then asked Sven to confirm their target, a level 2 Komodo dragon. Sven agreed and pointed out that the location of its nest was marked on the map. Blake, curious, asked what the level system referred to, shocking Sven that he didn't know. Sven explained that monsters were classified into 10 levels of strength, with level 1 being the weakest, and level 10 the strongest. Blake thanked Sven for the information, and Sven proudly replied not to mention it. But before Sven could bask in his explanation, Therese and Clara began walking ahead. Therese called back to them asking what they were doing and reminding them that they needed to keep moving. Sven, startled, shouted for them not to leave him behind as he scrambled to catch up. An hour passed as they continued their trek through the forest. Suddenly, rustling came from a nearby bush. The group turned to see goblins hiding within. Sven, recognizing them as level 1 monsters, quickly cast a fire spell and threw it at one of the goblins, boasting that he could handle them alone. His attack hit one goblin, but the 2 remaining goblins leaped at him simultaneously, making him panic. Before the goblins could reach Sven, a surge of strong magical power sliced through them, reducing them to pieces. It was Therese who scolded Sven, reminding him never to let his guard down. Sven sat down, holding his slightly injured arm, and grumbled to Therese that she didn't need to interfere. Clara, noticing his injury, healed him. Sven thanked her and apologized. Blake, observing from a short distance, stayed quiet. Sven turned to him, frustrated, and asked why he didn't help. Before Blake could reply, Therese reminded Sven that he had insisted he could handle it alone. Sven shouted at her to shut up but reluctantly agreed, turning to Blake to apologize. A short while later, as they continued walking, a monster appeared above Sven, ready to attack him. Blake, noticing it, stumbled intentionally, making it seem like an accident. Sven, unaware of the monster, dodged it without realizing the danger. Concerned, he asked Blake if he was all right, and Therese questioned what he was doing. Blake apologized, placing his hand on the ground as though steadying himself, but in reality, casting a spell. He told them he had found a path when he fell and suggested they head that way, pointing to a more open area. Sven agreed, noticing the clearer route, and the group proceeded in that direction. Therese called for Clara, who replied that she was coming. Unbeknownst to them, Blake quietly eliminated monsters behind them using his magic. Clara briefly sensed the power and turned to look but saw nothing unusual. A moment later, Blake mentioned hearing the sound of water nearby and pointed ahead. When they arrived near a lake, the group took a moment to rest. Noticing monsters lurking nearby, Blake suggested they start moving again. After hours of travel, night fell, and the group decided to rest. The young magician slept while Blake took watch. As he stood guard, a massive beast crept toward them and growled before attempting to bite him. Blake's barrier automatically activated, blocking the attack and sending the beast away in pain. Sven, startled by the sound, woke up and asked if Blake had heard something. Blake calmly replied that he hadn't heard anything unusual. Sven offered to take over the watch, but Blake reassured him that he was fine and would wake him if needed. Sven thanked him and went back to sleep, unaware that Blake's barrier was silently protecting the entire area. The next day, as they resumed their journey, Sven noticed the surprising lack of monster encounters and commented that it was unsettling how smoothly things were going, even though the trek remained challenging. Clara observed Blake from the corner of her eye, thinking it was strange that they had only faced weak monsters so far. She recalled the rumors about Blake defeating Vice Captain Gunther and wondered if Blake was somehow influencing their situation. Therese interjected, pointing out that the lack of strong monsters was a good thing. She remarked that they were already exhausted from all the walking, and encountering powerful monsters would be disastrous. She urged the group to hurry toward the Komodo dragon's nest. Meanwhile, in the Hindira kingdom, Gunther smirked to himself. Convinced that Blake and his team were as good as dead, he had ensured they were sent to the most dangerous location. Even if they managed to reach Mecha Forest, the route was infested with monsters. And should they somehow arrive at the target destination, they wouldn't find a Komodo dragon, but a level 4 salamander instead. As the group reached their supposed target, they froze in terror upon seeing the salamander. The youngest magicians panicked, and Therese shouted that salamanders were monsters capable of burning down entire villages with a single breath. She declared that they needed to run immediately. However, before they could act, another salamander appeared behind them, trapping the group. Sven dropped to his knees, trembling and stuttering that it was over, convinced they couldn't win. Therese and Clara were silent, shaking in fear. The first salamander began gathering fire in its mouth and released a blazing breath toward them. The group screamed in terror. Therese, tears streaming down her face, opened her eyes, confused to find that it wasn't hot. Unbeknownst to them, Blake stood calmly, shielding them from the deadly flames with his barrier. The group was stunned as they saw the barrier blocking the flames. Clara asked in disbelief if it was Blake's doing. The salamander unleashed an even stronger torrent of fire, causing Sven to scream in panic, shouting that it was impossible to escape even with the barrier. Blake slowly walked out of the barrier, surprising everyone. Smiling, he told them to stay put and wait. Sven, alarmed, asked what he meant by that and called out to him. But Blake continued walking forward. Sven shouted desperately, asking if Blake was planning to act as a decoy. He insisted there was no way a barrier mage could defeat a salamander. Therese, trying to remain composed, told them that Blake's sacrifice couldn't be in vain and instructed the team to escape through the weakest part of the flames the moment the barrier disappeared. Sven angrily protested, shouting that they couldn't just abandon the old man. Therese retorted that there was no way they could defeat a salamander. Clara, watching from within the barrier, noticed that the flames outside were beginning to weaken. The team stared in confusion, wondering what was happening. Then they saw it. Blake rushing toward the salamander and with a sharp-edged barrier, slicing its head off in a single swing. The salamander's body collapsed, its severed head crashing to the ground. The group froze in stunned silence, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Blake had defeated the salamander in an instant. Blake noticed the second salamander to his side gathering an immense amount of fire in its mouth. It unleashed a blazing attack at him, but he managed to jump out of the way. Using his barriers as makeshift shields, he remained in the air. The salamander tilted its head, aiming to attack again, but Blake skillfully avoided the fireballs by creating a ladder of shield tiles in midair. As he reached the salamander, Blake cast a crystallized barrier, wrapping it around his fist. He launched his fist toward the salamander, striking its head with tremendous force. The impact slammed the salamander into the ground, shattering the earth beneath it. With the salamander defeated, Blake deactivated his shields and landed safely. Calmly picking up his equipment, he remarked, "That's the end of it." Reflecting on the encounter, he recalled having fought many similar lizards in the dense forest near the demon realm. He speculated that these salamanders, though said to be level 4, were probably just weaker individuals. The young magicians, still in shock, rushed to him, shouting in awe. They bombarded him with questions. How was he so strong? Was it a barrier technique? How could barriers, traditionally used for defense, be used to attack? Blake, perplexed by their astonishment, replied modestly, saying he didn't think of himself as strong. He explained that he had occasionally hunted monsters while maintaining the barrier in the demon realm, which seemed to downplay his abilities in their eyes. Clara, however, couldn't believe what she had seen. Blake hadn't just used his barriers for defense or attack, he had also used them as a foothold to maneuver midair. She began to wonder if barrier techniques were far more versatile and powerful than she had imagined. Quietly, she concluded that Blake might not be just an ordinary old man. Days later, back at the dormitory stage, Gunther was laughing to himself, confident that Blake must be dead. He smugly thought of how he had ensured Blake's demise by assigning him and his team to treacherous mountain paths, hordes of monsters, and the salamander's nest. The senior officer arrived at the stage, waiting to greet returning teams. As one team returned, the senior praised them for doing excellent work. Gunther, watching from the sidelines, scoffed, believing it was impossible for Blake's team to survive. However, the senior announced that Team F had returned first. Gunther froze in shock, unable to process what he had just heard. How could they still be alive? And not only alive, they were the first team to return. Gunther tried to calm himself, reasoning that they must have fled back without completing the task and likely hadn't brought any monster materials with them. The senior officer shouted in disbelief, causing Gunther to smirk, thinking his assumptions were correct. However, the senior then exclaimed his surprise at seeing a salamander's fang among the materials the team had brought back. He declared that it was a top-level result in their training history. Gunther began to sweat, unable to believe that a group of so-called dropouts and a barrier mage had managed to defeat a salamander. The senior praised the team for their outstanding performance and announced that their success would significantly boost their scores. He encouraged them to keep up the good work in future training. The team cheered, thrilled by their achievement. The senior then turned to his co-senior and asked if there was a salamander's nest on the training route. The co-senior, puzzled, replied that the preliminary survey had only identified low-level monsters in the area. Meanwhile, Sven proudly proclaimed that he couldn't believe they were at the top of the leaderboard. Therese reminded him that most of the credit belonged to Blake, as he had defeated the salamander and guided them safely back. Clara agreed, noting that they couldn't have accomplished it without him. Sven approached Blake shyly and thanked him. Blake modestly replied that it wasn't true, insisting that they had overcome obstacles because everyone had worked hard and all he had done was lend a little help. Sven was visibly moved by Blake's humility. Therese smiled and told Blake that she would choose to believe him anyway. Sven added that Blake was a good guy, and Clara also thanked him. However, Blake couldn't shake the feeling that they had been at a significant disadvantage compared to other teams, and suspected that their success might not have been entirely coincidental. While the group chatted and celebrated, Gunther stood nearby, shaking with rage and glaring at Blake. His mind swirled with thoughts of revenge, vowing that he wouldn't let it slide. A few days later, the trainees gathered for another session. The instructor announced that today's training would take the form of a competition, and the teams were to split up accordingly. Sven remarked that the main training ground seemed cramped, and Therese suggested moving to the less crowded second training ground. Clara agreed, and the group headed off in that direction. Gunther noticed them leaving and smiled as a devious plan began forming in his mind. At the second training ground, Sven suggested testing Blake's abilities, but Blake jokingly told him to take it easy on him. Suddenly, Gunther appeared and ordered them to wait. Gunther added that since they were using the second training ground, he would instruct them personally. Sven whispered to Therese, asking why Vice Captain Gunther was participating in their training. Therese replied that she had heard he was helping out due to a shortage of instructors. Gunther noticed their whispers and shouted at them, demanding to know what they were talking about before ordering them to gather immediately. The group reluctantly replied, "Yes, sir." Gunther then turned to Blake and sneered, telling him that he wasn't needed and should just stand there like an idiot and watch. Gunther faced the trainees and began their instruction. Moments later, Therese was lying on the ground, covered in injuries. Clara rushed to her side and healed her wounds. Gunther teased them, asking why they weren't taking the exercise seriously and pointing out that if their opponent were a real monster, they would already be dead. Gunther shouted at them to get up, declaring that the instruction wasn't over yet. Blake tried to approach the injured trainees, but Gunther barked at him to stay put, reminding him that he had been ordered not to move. Gunther mockingly explained that he was only instructing the trainees because they were weak. Blake glared at Gunther in anger, but Gunther merely smirked, pleased to see the frustration on Blake's face. It was exactly what he wanted, to make Blake feel powerless. Gunther turned back to the trainees, demanding they stop dawdling and get into position. Gathering fire magic in his hands, he aimed it at the group. "If you can't get into position," he shouted, "I'll make you." Gunther released a torrent of fire toward the terrified trainees who screamed in fear. Gunther's attack exploded, but he teasingly told Blake that it seemed his comrades had gotten into quite a predicament and that his hand had slipped because Blake had insulted him. Gunther then faced Blake and told him not to misunderstand. It was just guidance, and he hadn't killed them. However, he admitted he might have gotten a bit too passionate with the guidance, so they were probably a bit singed. Gunther proudly pointed at the new trainees, telling Blake that the smoke was starting to clear and that he should behold the miserable state of his comrades. But when the smoke disappeared, the trainees were safe, thanks to a shield. This shocked Gunther, who asked why they were unharmed. Sven looked at his body, wondering if it was a barrier and if the old man had created it. Gunther glanced at Blake, wondering if he had done something, but noticed that Blake hadn't moved. Meanwhile, the instructors noticed the situation between Gunther and Team F. They also saw that the trainees looked pretty beaten up and asked what had happened. Gunther explained that he was giving them guidance, but it seemed the trainees had reached their limit, and he was just about to wrap things up. However, Sven shouted that it wasn't guidance but bullying, and Therese angrily added that she was furious Gunther had planned to end it like that. Blake observed them, and Clara firmly said that she wanted to win with everyone's power. The three trainees confidently looked at Blake, and he nodded in response. They all then told Gunther that they could still keep going, urging him to continue the guidance and promising they wouldn't lose. The instructors were touched by their determination and encouraged them to hang in there and not lose to the vice captain. Gunther, annoyed but unable to back out without losing face, agreed. The trainees encouraged each other to work together and win. Gunther unleashed his fire magic, telling them there was no way they could beat him. He attacked with a huge fireball, but they didn't even flinch, remaining unharmed thanks to Blake's shield. Sven teasingly told Gunther that his magic wouldn't work on them. Gunther was shocked to see a barrier around them and called them cowards. However, the trainees simply aimed their magic at Gunther while Sven mockingly asked who was really being underhanded, calling Gunther a bastard. The trainees then launched their combined attack at Gunther. Sven was thrilled that they had managed to land a hit, but Gunther furiously glared at them and called them bastards, threatening that they wouldn't get away with it. This shocked and frightened them. Blake immediately jumped in to protect the trainees, glaring at Gunther. Suddenly, one of the instructors shouted that it was enough and demanded to know what Gunther was doing. Gunther tried to explain that he was just providing guidance, but the instructor sternly told him to stop making excuses. He stated that he knew Gunther held a grudge against Blake and had been harassing Team F. The instructor revealed that he had investigated everything and angrily announced that, as of that day, Gunther was relieved of his duties and should prepare for demotion. Gunther was left speechless, wondering why he had to suffer like this and blaming it all on Blake. A moment later, they were in the room when Sven remarked that Gunther got what he deserved, which they all agreed with. Therese added that it felt so good to see it and mentioned that even their starting point for the exercise seemed to have been part of Gunther's harassment. Sven called Gunther a scumbag for holding a grudge against Blake. Blake apologized to them for causing trouble because of him, but Sven immediately told him it wasn't his fault. Therese agreed that they had gotten caught up in it, prompting Sven to tell her not to say things like that. They all gathered around Blake and asked him how he was so strong. Therese told him that he was using barriers unlike anything she had ever seen, and Clara said she was interested. He was about to reply when there was a knock on the door. A lady opened it and informed him that, by order of Lady Edda, the Witch of Wisdom, they had come to escort him. Confused, he pointed at himself, but the lady grabbed him and dragged him out of the room, saying they should depart at once. Therese asked if she meant Edda, the hero's party member, while Clara wondered aloud who Blake really was. A moment later, they arrived at the Hendria Kingdom, specifically at the Magic Research Institute. The Witch of Wisdom and director of the institute, 13-year-old Edda, greeted him and said it had been a while. He greeted her back, telling her he was glad to see that she was doing well. He was about to pat her head when the lady stopped him, stuttering as she reminded him that Edda was a once-in-a-generation genius magician, and treating her like a child was extremely disrespectful. He apologized to Edda and asked if she didn't like it, but Edda replied that it was fine and she didn't mind. Edda quickly moved to the point, explaining that the reason she called him there was to borrow his power to capture monsters. She explained that capturing monsters was difficult. Physical cages didn't work because the monsters would just rampage. Furthermore, while it varied by individual, monsters emitted miasma, which limited research to on-site studies. Even then, those studies had their limits. Edda added that if they could capture and examine monsters at the Research Institute, they could investigate monster ecology and characteristics, analyze miasma, and potentially develop countermeasures against it. Blake noted that heroes had the goddess's protection, allowing them to completely block miasma. This meant only the hero's party could enter the demon realm with its high miasma concentration. Returning to the original topic, Etta asked Blake if he could capture monsters of level 5 or higher using his barriers. One of the ladies interrupted, saying Etta was overestimating barrier mages and that such a thing wasn't possible. However, Blake simply replied that he thought he could. The lady was shocked and asked him to repeat what he had said. He calmly reiterated that he could capture monsters of level 5 or higher, which made Etta relax and smile. He reasoned that if a salamander was level 4, capturing level 5 monsters should be fine. However, the lady angrily shouted at him, accusing him of making outrageous claims just because Etta was present. She insisted that there was no way he could do it with mere barriers. Blake reassured her that he thought it would be fine, but the lady accused him of lying. Etta intervened, firmly stating that Blake's cooperation had already been decided and she wouldn't tolerate further objections. This frightened the ladies, who immediately apologized. Etta then told Blake not to worry about the Magician Corps because she would submit a request to count his research cooperation as training. Blake acknowledged her plan and thanked her. However, the ladies silently speculated that Blake might have some kind of leverage over Etta and decided they needed to protect her, which gave Blake a bad feeling and made him worried. Etta then loudly announced that they were heading to the abandoned Burburn mine and instructed everyone to move out immediately. Minutes later, they were all ready. Etta told Blake that it was a stroke of luck to be reunited with her benefactor. She asked him if he had met the others, to which he replied that he had met Alice, and Alice seemed to be doing well. This made Etta laugh as she remarked that Alice was always like that. They laughed together, which irritated the lady, who wondered why Blake seemed to get along so well with Etta when he was just a mere barrier mage. Etta then recounted that if he hadn't saved them in the Forest of Death, they would have undoubtedly lost their lives. Blake recalled that day. He had been hunting in the forest just outside the demon realm, the Forest of Death. By chance, he had found someone alive being attacked by monsters, so he stepped in to save her. When he asked Alice if she was all right, she begged him to help her comrades. He immediately carried Alice and searched the area, eventually finding Etta surrounded by monsters. Etta explained that the Forest of Death bewilders the senses of those who enter, causing them to get separated and wander aimlessly. She added that if he hadn't saved them, they would have died there, and thanked him again for his help. Blake whispered to her that he hadn't done anything special, but she laughed and told him he hadn't changed a bit. Suddenly, children ran past them, happily playing. Blake observed them, and remarked that they looked like they were having fun. He shared that he had been maintaining barriers alone since he was 9 and envied that kind of carefree life. Etta responded surprised that he had been alone all that time. Blake wondered if she had ever played like that, but Etta proudly replied that she was a natural-born genius magician and would never have played with children. Yet as she peeked at the children, her gaze softened and she stared at them sadly. A few days later, they arrived at the abandoned Burburn mine. They noticed there was more miasma than they had expected. The lady remarked to Etta that it seemed dangerous for anyone except her. Etta then asked Blake if it was possible for him to create a barrier around them and move it. The lady softly doubted it, wondering if such a thing was possible. Blake replied that he could, making the lady shout in disbelief, insisting there was no way it was possible. Without a word, Blake began casting his barrier magic and walked into the dense miasma. The lady shouted that entering such high-density miasma was suicidal and that this was the result of trying to show off. But Blake turned back and casually asked if they weren't coming, leaving them all stunned that he was still alive. Etta remarked that the effects of Blake's barrier were as they could see and decided they should leave the dragon carriage behind, as it couldn't enter the mine. This further shocked the group. As they entered the mine, they marveled that the barrier truly protected them from such an intense level of miasma, something they had never even heard of before. Despite this, the lady arrogantly claimed that a barrier blocking miasma wasn't that impressive. As they walked deeper into the mine, Blake noted that there were no monsters nearby. Etta explained that it seemed there was a miasma pool deep inside. Blake surmised that this meant there must be a creature causing the miasma. Etta added that it could also be a cursed object or a natural phenomenon. She elaborated that cursed objects, whether created by humans or naturally occurring in ominous places, generate miasma. Sometimes powerful monsters that produce large amounts of miasma are suddenly born. Miasma creates monsters, which in turn intensify the miasma, resulting in the birth of even more monsters. The Demon King was the ultimate example of this cycle. Etta explained that, strangely enough, when they defeated the monster that was the source of the miasma, all monsters born from the miasma disappeared. Similarly, when the Demon King was defeated, half of the monsters in the demon realm vanished. However, not all monsters in the world disappeared. Blake smiled as Etta explained. Etta added that if they could understand the principle behind the creation of miasma and monsters, they might be able to devise countermeasures, making their mission extremely important. Etta didn't see the stone in front of her and accidentally tripped. Fortunately, Blake caught her from behind just in time, making her shy. He then asked if she was okay, but she simply apologized. Blake told her that the uneven ground was hard to see, so it might be dangerous, and asked if she would like him to carry her on his back. The lady immediately pushed him away, shouting at him not to treat Etta like a child, and reminding him that Etta was a genius magician, different from ordinary humans. Etta told them she was fine and that they should keep going. A moment later, they came across a room filled with thick miasma. A monster emerged from hiding, growling loudly when it saw them. They were horrified to discover that it was a level 5 Minotaur. Blake told Etta that they should capture it, but the lady walked past him and told him to stand back, claiming they would handle it. The research team magicians began attacking the Minotaur with their magic power, but the Minotaur merely smiled and roared loudly, deflecting every attack. The lady and the others were shocked by its resilience. Etta shouted that normal magic wouldn't be enough to capture it, as she had suspected, and they needed Blake, the barrier mage. The lady stammered, asking Etta if she truly meant that she could capture the monster, leaving Etta stunned. The team members began urging Etta to handle it herself, declaring that she was the Witch of Wisdom. Under pressure, Etta clenched her teeth and stepped forward, agreeing with her team. She raised her wand and stood in front of the Minotaur, determined, but visibly tense. Blake watched her with worry as she prepared her magic. The Minotaur let out a deafening roar, stunning Etta in place. Noticing her hesitation, Blake saw the Minotaur raise its massive axe and swing it at her. Fortunately, a strong barrier appeared, blocking the attack, shocking the lady and the other team members. Blake quickly surrounded the Minotaur with his barrier, tightly locking it inside. The lady stammered before shouting at him not to interfere and to stay out of Etta's way. Etta interrupted, shouting for them to stop and reminding them that they had brought Blake specifically to capture the monster. Still fearful, the lady argued that the barrier would surely be destroyed. Etta calmly told them to look at the monster and explained that a refined barrier could block and purify miasma. By sealing the monster within the barrier, they could weaken it. The lady stuttered, admitting she hadn't known barriers had such effects. Etta approached the barrier, astonished to see the level 5 monster rendered completely powerless. She thought it was an incredible feat, knowing her magic couldn't achieve such results. Turning around, Etta thanked Blake for capturing the monster. She then told everyone that they should return immediately. Walking past Blake with a smile, she told him he had saved them and to keep carrying the monster like that. Blake watched her walk out first, wondering with concern if she had been scared. Days later, Etta praised everyone for doing a great job and announced that they could now begin researching the captured monsters. The team stared at the huge Minotaur in front of them. Etta knocked on the barrier holding the Minotaur and remarked that barriers were truly convenient, as they could move such a large body with ease. She asked Blake how long he could maintain the barrier, to which he replied that as long as he was nearby, he could maintain it semi-permanently. However, he added that normal barriers lose their effect when the magic supply is cut off. Etta noted that this was problematic and asked if there was a way around it. The lady suggested that it might be better to recapture the monster using Etta's magic power, but Blake pulled out a seal mark and told Etta it should solve the issue. The lady became irritated, asking if there was anything Blake couldn't do. Etta asked him what the seal mark was, and Blake explained that it was a magic circle he had created to maintain the barrier around the demon realm. It could automatically sustain the barrier for a while without constant input of magic power. Etta paused, remembering seeing something similar near the demon realm. She mentioned that she had never heard of such a magic circle and commented that the creator must have been quite remarkable. Blake awkwardly laughed and thanked her, surprising Etta. She asked if he had created it himself, to which he simply replied yes. He then explained that he believed he was around 9 years old when he developed it. Blake elaborated, saying that 30 years ago, as the demon realm's miasma was eroding the continent, barrier mages were gathered to address the crisis. However, there was nothing prepared for them, and at first they had to maintain the barrier directly. Naturally, this meant they couldn't leave their posts. To solve this, he developed a magic circle that could store magical power. By injecting magic power into it, the barrier could be maintained for extended periods, allowing the mages to take breaks and get food. He added that with 100 people replenishing the magic power, they planned to create a barrier around the entire demon realm. However, in the end, it seemed he was the only one left to carry out the task. As a result, the process required a massive amount of magic power, which was extremely difficult. Everyone was shocked upon hearing his story. Noticing their reactions, Blake asked if something was wrong. Etta excitedly told him that he had accomplished something incredible and asked why he wasn't boasting about it more. He replied that it wasn't really a big deal, then placed both his hands on the magic circle and suggested they set aside that story for now. Blake began casting magic power and asked Etta if they should activate the barrier magic circle. He then cast a barrier around the Minotaur, telling her that it should last for a few hours. Just to be safe, he said he would stay nearby during the research. Etta smiled and told him that was very helpful. Etta announced to everyone that the research could now begin and tasked her team with analyzing the monsters and miasma. They all agreed enthusiastically and quickly got to work. Moments later, the research team was busy while Blake stood guard over the Minotaur. Later that night, everyone else had gone to rest, leaving only Blake and Etta in the lab. The lady excused herself and Blake noticed that everyone except Etta had gone home. Etta, still busy with her work, told him she had prepared a room for him in the research facility. She suggested he feel free to return there anytime and reminded him he only needed to be present when a magic injection was necessary. Blake asked her about herself. She replied that she had to continue advancing the research as quickly as possible to protect the citizens who feared the threat of monsters and miasma. Blake told her he would stay, which prompted Etta to ask if he was being considerate. She added that if that was the case, it wasn't necessary. Blake replied that he was simply worried the barrier might break, as this was his first time setting up an injection-type barrier outside the demon realm. Etta, unfazed, told him to do as he pleased, to which Blake responded that he would. 1 week later, the team was still researching the monster and miasma. At night, as always, everyone had gone to rest, leaving only Etta and Blake in the lab. The lady excused herself to rest as well. Blake told Etta he was stepping out for a bit, and she simply signed for him to go. He then approached the lady and asked if she had a moment. The lady asked what it was, and Blake explained that he didn't mean to interfere with their policies, but was curious why everyone except Etta left early. The lady angrily asked if he was being sarcastic, calling him an outsider, and told him not to meddle. Blake calmly replied that Etta had been researching alone the entire time and asked if they didn't intend to help her. The lady retorted that he didn't understand and explained that Etta was a genius, so there was nothing ordinary people like them could do to assist her. She added that Etta wasn't just a genius in magic but also in research, and no one could keep up with her. While they contributed during work hours, staying beyond that would only hinder Etta. Turning away, the lady told Blake that if he didn't need to stay, he should go home too. She then walked off, leaving him sighing in frustration. Returning to the research room, he found a tired little Etta asleep at her desk. He noticed the dark circles under her eyes and gently placed her coat over her to keep her warm. A few days later, Etta announced that it was lunchtime and told everyone to take a break. The team eagerly rushed out, discussing what they were eating and praising the cafeteria's steak. Left alone, Etta wearily pulled out a piece of bread. Blake told her that she had been cooped up in the lab and suggested she take a proper break too. She replied that she was planning to rest in her room and apologized for always keeping him there. Blake awkwardly laughed and assured her that he was staying because he wanted to. Etta then told him not to worry about her and to take a break himself, to which he reluctantly agreed. Blake headed to the cafeteria, where he saw the team enjoying their meals. One member commented that, as expected of Lady Etta, she continued researching alone, and her dedication was admirable. Others chimed in, proudly stating that they couldn't even compare to her and would only get in the way. They also mentioned that the research level was so high they didn't even understand what Etta was doing, and praised her for being able to capture monsters on her own without issue. The lady confidently told everyone to leave everything to Etta, saying all problems were solved by her genius. She added that Etta was a treasure of the Hendria kingdom, and as long as they followed her, everything would be fine. Blake disagreed, saying he didn't feel the same. The group stood up in anger, demanding to know what he meant. Blake seriously told them that simply praising Etta as a genius and leaving everything to her wasn't what adults should do. Etta was still just a 13-year-old child. The lady shouted at him not to treat Etta like a child, reminding him that she was the greatest genius magician in history, far beyond their level. The others agreed, claiming that while Etta might look like a child, she was a mature adult on the inside, and that Blake didn't understand anything. Blake conceded that Etta was incredibly talented in magic and research, likely more capable than most adults. However, he argued that this didn't necessarily mean she was an adult emotionally. He pointed out how Etta had looked enviously at the other children, and how she had been scared during their encounter with the Minotaur. He added that Etta was smart and kind, which was likely why she acted in ways that pleased the adults around her. Walking closer to the lady, Blake asked if they could truly say with certainty that Etta was an adult. He questioned whether they had ever had an honest conversation with her, tried to understand her feelings, or considered helping her. The group fell silent at his words. The lady tried to respond, but couldn't come up with anything. Suddenly, one of the men grabbed the lady and told everyone to leave. They all walked away, only to pass a tired-looking Etta who had been watching them. However, none of them said anything to her. Blake tried to approach Etta to explain, but she turned away and walked off, leaving him worried. Later that night, as Blake sat in his room deep in thought, there was a knock at his door. When he opened it, Etta stood there and asked if she could have a moment with him. Blake gently made Etta sit down on his bed and poured her a cup of hot tea. He handed it to her, and she apologized for the trouble. He simply placed his coat over her shoulders and told her it was cold. She thanked him for the gesture and sipped the tea, softly remarking that it was warm. After finishing her tea, Etta remained silent for a moment before awkwardly apologizing for involving him in her affairs during the day. Blake disagreed, explaining that he was the one who stuck his nose where it didn't belong. He then asked if things had always been like this for her. Etta replied that at first she was full of enthusiasm. However, as she continued working with others, things changed. Gradually, they started praising her as a genius witch, and their expectations shifted, making things easier for them. Blake asked if he was right in assuming that her workload increased, while others began doing the bare minimum. Etta nodded, saying it had always been like that. She explained that people around her kept changing because of her. She then opened up about her past, telling him she was born to ordinary parents in a small village with no noble or magical lineage in her family. Despite this, she learned language shortly after birth, and, by chance, read through a magic book her parents happened to own. She became fascinated with magic, and her parents noticed. From that day on, they gave her every possible form of magical education, and she became deeply engrossed in it. As a result, everyone started calling her a genius and expecting her to act the part. Etta continued, saying she was forced to act like an adult instead of a child because of the prejudice that geniuses must mature emotionally faster. For magicians, research and combat were considered their true calling. As such, she was made to study both, starting at the tender age of 6. She became desperate, trying to live up to the expectations of her parents and the adults around her. They saw her as a genius, not a child, and she felt compelled to try her hardest. She hesitated, tightly clenching her hands, and Blake gently asked if he was right in guessing that she was afraid of monsters. Etta's eyes widened in surprise, and she asked if he had noticed. Blake explained that he had seen it when he saved her in the past, and again when they faced the Minotaur. She had looked scared. Shyly, she admitted he was observant, and confessed that she was terrified of facing monsters. When she was in the hero's party, she had managed to endure it because the frontliners fought the monsters directly while she only supported them from the back. Her voice trembling, Etta swore to him that she was absolutely terrified of monsters and could never fight them alone. Blake calmly told her he understood, revealing that he too was scared of fighting monsters. Surprised, she pointed out that he never seemed afraid. He explained that he had simply suppressed his fear and fought because if he didn't, he wouldn't survive. Over time, the fear became numb. Etta responded sadly, wishing she could have done the same. Blake warmly told her she didn't need to because Etta was fine just as she was. Panicking, Etta screamed that everyone expected her to be strong. They wanted her to be a genius and someone powerful. Shaking, she held her head and frantically said she had to try her hardest or she would disappoint them. She had to be strong enough to defeat monsters, or else she would be abandoned. Her voice broke as she recalled hearing her parents questioning who would need a daughter who wasn't a genius. She imagined her instructors dismissing her as a worthless disciple without talent. She heard the villagers asking if she wasn't truly a genius after all, and her co-workers shouting that they wouldn't follow an ordinary person. Overwhelmed, Etta clutched her ears in pain, begging the voices not to leave her or abandon her. She vowed to be good, to be a genius, to act like an adult. She pleaded with them not to abandon her. Suddenly, she felt Blake gently pat her head. His voice calm and soothing, he told her, "It's okay." Blake gently swore to Etta that he would never abandon her, and his words calmed her down. He told her that what she had gone through was hard and that she had suffered so much. Then, he softly asked if it had been tough, making her burst into tears. Blake praised her for doing a great job, and upon hearing his warm and sweet words, Etta couldn't hold back any longer. She hugged him tightly, like an ordinary child in pain, and cried out that she wanted to play with friends, eat sweets, take a break from work, and spend more fun time with her family. She confessed that while she loved research, she hated fighting monsters because it was scary and painful. Through her sobs, she asked why she couldn't rely on others. Blake explained that children are allowed to be vulnerable with adults, but Etta shook her head and said that everyone told her that because she was a genius, she couldn't show weakness. As the Witch of Wisdom, she was expected to behave like an adult. Blake gently patted her head and reassured her that she didn't need to try so hard. Whenever she was struggling, suffering, or even for no particular reason, she could always rely on him. Etta looked at him and hesitantly asked if it was really okay. Blake smiled warmly and assured her that it was. When she asked again, needing confirmation, he firmly replied that he meant it. Etta hugged him tightly, feeling a warmth she hadn't experienced in a long time. She rested her head on his lap, finally letting herself relax. She thanked him softly while he held her hand and gently patted her head, calming her further. Blake smiled as he saw her, now calm and vulnerable, acting like the child she truly was. As he gazed outside, Blake's thoughts drifted back to the day he had saved Etta from a swarm of monsters. After defeating them, he rushed to her side, finding her collapsed in fear. Later, as Etta and Alice rested, he prepared to step away to reinforce the barrier when he heard Etta crying in her sleep. Her trembling hand reached out as though searching for someone. In that moment, Blake saw a pitiful child who just wanted to be accepted. He held her hand, and just like now, she calmed down and relaxed at his touch. Even in her sleep, Etta begged him not to go, and not to leave her all alone. Blake had gently replied that he was right there and wasn't going anywhere. A few days later, Blake was strolling down the street in casual clothes. As he waited, a child approached him, her voice cheerful as she asked if she had kept him waiting. Blake smiled warmly as he saw Etta dressed like a child, free from the burdens of her title and expectations. Several days ago, Etta encouraged her team, saying they should work hard together that day as well. They stutteringly replied with a hesitant yes, and agreed to do their best. They began their tasks while Etta focused on hers, unaware of their awkward glances in her direction, something Blake noticed. At night, as usual, everyone took their leave, leaving Etta alone in the research room. The next day, the same routine repeated. Etta led the team as usual, and the day after that, nothing changed. Everyone continued to act the same. On the fourth day, while Etta was reading a book, she realized she couldn't focus or understand anything. Frustrated, she shut the book and walked toward Blake. Without warning, she hugged him tightly and shouted that she couldn't take it anymore. She confessed she was exhausted and didn't want to do anything else. Blake softly patted her head and told her it must have been tough. Eda, comforted by his warmth, happily asked him to pat her more and give her a big hug, which he gladly did. Noticing her stress, Blake wished he could do something for her. He asked if she had a day off the following day and whether there was anything she'd like to do. Eda replied that there was. She wanted to go out with him. The next day, they met at the street market. Eda asked if she had kept him waiting, but Blake smiled and assured her he hadn't waited at all. He then asked if they should get going. As they strolled through the bustling market, both were amazed by the variety of stalls and the lively crowd. Blake asked if it was her first time visiting the market street, and Eda admitted that it was. She explained that since coming to the royal capital, she hadn't gone out much and had never played in the city before. Blake smiled and told her it was wonderful, confusing her. Taking her hand, he softly dragged her along, saying that exploring something for the first time was always more fun. Eda's excitement grew, and she wholeheartedly agreed. They explored the market together, sampling sweets and enjoying themselves. At one point, Eda noticed a group of children chasing each other and playing. Blake encouraged her to join them. Watching her play happily like a normal child made him smile. As night fell, the market stalls began to close, and it was time for Eda to say goodbye to her new friends. She smiled warmly at Blake and thanked him for the day. On their way back to the Magic Research Institute, Eda stopped to admire some shiny jewelry at a nearby stall. Blake noticed her gaze and asked if she had found something she liked, which made her flustered. She hesitated but began looking at the jewelry. Blake picked up a necklace with a shining blue pendant that she had been staring at and told the seller he would take it. Eda panicked, insisting she would pay for it herself, but Blake smiled and told her it was a gift. Stunned, Eda watched as he paid for the necklace. The seller handed it to Eda, and she proudly raised the necklace, thanking Blake with a big smile. She hugged the gift adorably, making the seller laugh and comment that Blake was a kind father with an adorable daughter. Both Blake and Eda froze in surprise before laughing together without correcting the misunderstanding. They returned to the institute, both in high spirits. 1 week later, the team gathered in the research room. Eda shyly apologized to everyone, admitting that she hadn't been able to figure out how to counter the miasma. However, she shared that she had come to reappreciate the usefulness of barrier techniques, especially for completely blocking and purifying miasma. She announced her plan to gather more barrier mages and advance their research on barriers. Turning to Blake, she asked if he would cooperate with them again. He smiled and replied with a confident yes. Before the conversation could continue, the lady interrupted, surprising both Eda and Blake. The entire team suddenly bowed deeply and sincerely apologized in unison. The lady confessed that due to their inferiority complex, they had completely relied on Eda, shifting all responsibility onto her because she was a genius. Worse, they had neglected their efforts and grown complacent. She also admitted that, out of jealousy, they had behaved disrespectfully toward Blake, looking down on barrier mages to protect their own pride. They bowed again, apologizing to both Eda and Blake. Eda reassured them that it was all right and that she didn't mind. Blake agreed, saying he felt the same as Eda. Eda then placed her hand on the lady's shoulder, gently reminding her that relying on her entirely was troublesome. She encouraged them to put in more effort and work hard from now on. The lady, touched by Eda's words, thanked her for her kindness. The other members surrounded Blake to apologize as well. They admitted that the incident had made them understand the greatness of barrier techniques, recognizing them as truly amazing magic. While the group happily chatted with Blake, Eda quietly asked the lady why they had decided to apologize. The lady explained that it was thanks to Blake. She admitted that they had always noticed Eda wasn't feeling well and knew they were partly responsible for it. However, they lacked the courage to face their own helplessness. The lady added that Blake had scolded them, helped Eda, and made her cheerful again, which gave them the courage to take a step forward. She concluded by saying both Blake and his barrier techniques were truly wonderful. Eda immediately agreed, smiling as she told the lady from the bottom of her heart, "Blake really is wonderful." The next day, the members of the research team and Eda escorted Blake outside. Eda told him she would let him know if there was any progress, to which he replied that he would be waiting. Then, calling him closer, she whispered if he would indulge her again. He smiled and assured her he would do so any time, making her smile while her team looked on in confusion. Blake waved goodbye and walked away, realizing he hadn't been back to the dormitory in a while and wondering how everyone was doing. Later, back at the dormitory, Therese shouted at him for being late coming home. Clara glared at him, and Sven shouted that he had been worried. Panicking at their reactions, Blake began explaining what had happened while he was away. Sven exclaimed in disbelief, saying they all knew only a select few could enter the Magic Research Institute, and being close to 2 members of the heroes' party seemed impossible. They wondered aloud if barrier magic was truly that incredible and began questioning who Blake really was. Blake asked how things had been while he was gone. Sven grinned, saying he'd been waiting for that question. Proudly, he announced that he would show Blake the results of his training the next day. The next day at the training grounds, Therese, Clara, and Sven poured their magic power into their attacks, striking the training targets while Blake silently observed, though he couldn't help but feel worried. Sven cursed in frustration, shouting that he should be able to do better. Therese told him that getting stronger wasn't something that happened overnight. Another team passed by, mocking them as dropouts. They teased that they had barely passed before, and their recent success in the exercise must have been a fluke. Sven furiously shouted back, telling them to say whatever they wanted. Therese admitted that it couldn't be helped, as they really were dropouts. Clara agreed, adding that they had always been in last place. Sven, growing angrier, demanded to know if they were giving up and planning to rely on the old man again without doing anything themselves. Therese shouted that she didn't say that, but Sven turned and stormed off, saying he'd had enough and wouldn't give up. Therese whispered, wondering what was wrong with Sven, and Clara expressed concern. Blake quietly observed the situation. A moment later, Blake found Sven kneeling in front of him with his head down. Sven begged Blake to teach him magic, saying he needed to get stronger or he would be fired. Blake asked why Sven was going to such lengths, and Sven explained that he was the eldest son of a rural noble family and the only magician in their lineage. Because of this, he was expected to succeed. However, they were poor country nobles who couldn't live luxuriously. Sven wanted to earn money to improve his family's life. Blake told him he understood, but reminded him that he only knew barrier techniques. Sven responded that he understood and was disappointed. Blake then offered to teach him combat techniques instead, which made Sven overjoyed. Sven begged Blake to start immediately, and Blake suggested beginning the next day. Sven excitedly thanked him over and over. The following day, Sven was irritated to see Therese and Clara there as well. Therese teased him, saying he couldn't get ahead of them so easily. Clara added that it wasn't fair to rely on the old man alone. Blake explained that he had invited them because they seemed to feel the same way as Sven. Sven reluctantly admitted it might be true but complained that he had gone through the trouble of begging first. Blake apologized for that. Clara, standing behind Blake, thought to herself that she might discover the secret to his strength. Until now, she had only been casually observing him, but today, she planned to pay closer attention. Blake suddenly looked back at her and smiled, surprising Clara. Embarrassed, she quickly turned away and reminded herself to be more discreet. A moment later, they arrived at Mecha Forest. Sven was attacking a lizard with fire magic, giving his all to defeat it. When he successfully killed it, he proudly exclaimed that he could do it too. Suddenly, he heard a noise behind him and turned, only to find another lizard lunging at him with its mouth wide open. Before he could react, a sharp barrier swung around and sliced the lizard into pieces. Blake reminded Sven not to let his guard down, and Sven apologized. Therese shouted that the monsters were multiplying. Blake calmly walked forward and told them he would demonstrate. Forming a barrier sword, he explained that when faced with many enemies, wide-range magic was best. With a single swing, he effortlessly decapitated the surrounding lizards. Therese, stunned, asked if he wasn't a bit too strong. Clara asked why he was so powerful, and Sven questioned how he could do this if he was just a barrier mage maintaining the demon realm's defenses. Blake was surprised by their reactions and smiled, telling them it was an old story that would take a while to explain. After their training, they sat in a safe spot. Blake began recounting his story, saying it all started 30 years ago when he was just 9 years old. He, who had a talent for barrier techniques, was taken to the demon realm. There, he was tasked with creating barriers to suppress the miasma and monsters of the demon realm. They were given only meager wages, food, and water, and eventually, they were abandoned. He explained that because of their mission to continuously maintain barriers, they couldn't move from their assigned spot. As a result, there was hardly any time to sleep. Despite this, he continued maintaining the barrier. However, food began running out, and they couldn't get more supplies. He reached his limit, both in terms of exhaustion and physical strength. That's when he came up with an idea to create a magic circle that would automatically maintain the barrier. Clara exclaimed that she knew almost no one could develop magic circles, and Sven asked if he wasn't mistaken in assuming Blake must have failed. Blake replied that he managed to succeed through sheer effort, shocking Sven, who found it hard to believe. Blake continued, explaining that within a few days, he developed a magic circle that could be infused with magical power. On that day, he slept like a log. A few days later, he gave all his money to a passing merchant and asked him to relay the method for creating the magic circle to other barrier mages. However, his next problem was food and shelter. He decided to enter the nearby forest for hunting and gathering, but it was teeming with monsters. Frightened, he quickly ran back to the barrier. Although rations arrived every few months, even those eventually stopped coming. Desperate, he ventured into the forest again. He managed to gather some mushrooms but was spotted and attacked by a monster. Terrified, he ran for his life. With no other choice, he used his barrier to halt the monster for a moment, allowing him to return safely to the barrier. There wasn't much to gain, and the dense miasma in the forest required purification. Above all, his barriers were ineffective against monsters, so he resolved to become stronger. He focused on improving his barrier techniques, eventually succeeding in strengthening them to allow for short-term restraints. Thanks to these improvements, he could gather resources more efficiently. 3 years later, at the age of 12, he was hunting in the forest when a monster appeared beside him. He easily trapped it inside a square barrier and walked away, continuing his task. After years of training, His barrier techniques had become so refined that he could restrain most monsters for several minutes. He put down his gathered food and checked his magical power, feeling a sense of growth. However, he realized he still lacked the ability to defeat monsters. At that time, he realized that although his barriers were extremely sturdy, they couldn't be moved, making them unsuitable for attacking. Determined to find a solution, he worked tirelessly. 3 years later, when he was 15 years old, he finally succeeded in making the barriers mobile. He named this new method the offensive barrier technique. Using it, he hunted his first meat in years, purifying it to remove the miasma. He ate it with tears of joy. Driven by this success, he further researched barrier techniques, exploring their shapes, properties, hardness, softness, and viscosity. These efforts allowed him to create combat techniques using barriers, which he honed by fighting daily. As Blake narrated this story, a monster suddenly appeared behind him. The creature gathered fire in its mouth and hurled it at the group, but Blake effortlessly blocked it with a barrier, shocking the 3 kids. He leaped into the air, forming a sword by softening the barrier in his hand, and slashed the monster's head cleanly. He proudly told the kids that after years of hardship, he had become capable of such feats. Therese couldn't believe he had defeated another salamander in a single strike. Sven commented on how overwhelmingly strong Blake was, but Blake asked if they truly meant it, leaving them confused. Sven admitted he now understood why Blake was so powerful. Therese added that Blake's background was incredible, while Clara silently reflected on how painful it must have been, yet Blake didn't show it. She thought to herself that he was truly amazing, which made Blake look at them with confusion. Blake then lectured them, saying that if they trained as he did, they could also grow stronger and quickly reach his level. Therese questioned if such ignorance was terrifying, while Clara thought Blake was an insensitive old man. Sven, however, resolved not to be scared, thinking that if they wanted to become as strong as Blake, they had no choice but to try. As they heard monsters approaching, Blake excitedly pointed out 2 salamanders behind him, telling them they should fight the creatures next. He encouraged them, saying that if they gave it their best effort, they could defeat the monsters. Speechless and terrified, the 3 of them shouted in unison that there was no way they could fight them. Days later, in the kingdom, the elders followed Lancelot, praising him for his remarkable achievement of being appointed captain at such a young age. They admired his expertise in perfectly executing missions, which they expected from the Lord's flawless Lancelot. He told them that flawless was too grand a title for him, yet the elders praised his humility, calling it a wonderful trait. They remarked that there was no one better suited than Lancelot to become the next commander-in-chief. After saying their goodbyes, the elders departed, leaving Lancelot to remark to his comrade that the bureaucrat's eloquence was truly something else. His comrade responded that he believed their assessment of Lancelot was fair. Lancelot told his comrade that the elders were overestimating him, but his comrade insisted he should not be so modest since everyone relied on him. Lancelot walked silently, reflecting that he was not as exceptional as others believed. He thought of himself as someone with only a bit more talent than most, and admitted that his magic skills had been stagnating lately. Without any clear goals, he felt adrift. While he understood that the main duty of the Royal Magician Corps was to maintain public order, with the Demon King now dead, there were hardly any chances to face strong enemies. Though he knew peace was a blessing, he couldn't help but wonder how long he would need to keep meeting everyone's expectations. Later, while busy in his office, Lancelot's assistant entered and reported that nearby villages were being attacked by monsters. Lancelot deduced that the monsters were low level and suggested organizing the incident as field training for the new recruits. Looking over the paperwork, he pondered who should participate. The next day, Sven was visibly frustrated. Therese tried to calm him down, even though she herself was afraid, while Clara nervously stammered that it was nothing. Blake calmly asked if they were all right or needed some water, prompting Sven to shout at him. Asking how he could remain so calm when they were about to go on an expedition with the 1st Division, Blake simply replied that he was used to slaying monsters. Sven exclaimed that Blake's casual remark was insane, but then confidently told his team that they had been training under Blake too. Therese hesitantly asked if that meant they must have gotten at least a bit stronger. Other students, overhearing their conversation, laughed and teased them, mockingly calling them dropouts acting all nervous. Sven angrily turned back to glare at the mockers, shouting at them not to ridicule his team. Before the tension could escalate, an instructor ordered everyone to fall in line. The students immediately rushed to their positions, standing at attention. Lancelot walked onto the stage and announced the details of their mission. It would take 2 weeks to reach the village. Their targets were several dozen level 3 or lower monsters. He emphasized the importance of forming squads of 4 and maintaining coordination at all times. The recruits responded in unison with a resounding yes. The instructor then ordered them to begin their march, and the trainees followed the carriage out of the kingdom in a disciplined line. Hours into the march, the recruits were visibly fatigued. They had been walking in formation for 6 hours straight without a break. Many muttered complaints, saying they were dying from exhaustion as the steep slopes made their feet throb painfully. Fortunately, the instructor finally called for a 30-minute break, and the trainees collapsed to the ground, grateful for the respite. However, their relief was short-lived. The instructor barked at them, asking why they were lying around, and ordered them to tend to their squad members. Despite their exhaustion, the trainees obeyed, massaging their squad members' shoulders to relieve their weariness. Later that night, while the squad members peacefully slept, the new trainees stayed awake, taking turns as lookouts. Blake noticed they're struggling with their duties, watching them with concern etched on his face. 7 days later, they were still walking. Sven thought that if this kept up, he would die, while Therese, in tears, said she couldn't take it anymore. Clara, meanwhile, was so sleepy she could barely keep her eyes open. Blake cheerfully asked if they were okay and whether they were sure they didn't need any water. Sven, shocked, shouted at him, demanding to know why he was so energetic. Blake casually replied that he had been through similar experiences in the past. Therese then told Sven that Blake couldn't be judged by normal standards. Sven looked around and asked where the other trainees were. One of the senior squad members replied that those trainees had run away long ago. The senior added that Sven's group was doing quite well, since most people quit after just a few days. Another senior teasingly glanced at Blake and asked if he was the old man who got in on the hero's recommendation. The second senior, smirking, called Blake a middle-aged barrier mage and asked how he had managed to worm his way into the group. Furious, Sven shouted that Blake had earned his position through his own merits. Therese also defended him, yelling that the seniors didn't understand how strong Blake was. Annoyed, the seniors called them cheeky brats and warned them to learn how to properly address their seniors. One of the seniors even suggested the kids needed some disciplining. Fortunately, before the situation escalated, someone stepped in and asked what was going on. The group turned to see that it was Lancelot. Shocked, the seniors hastily claimed that nothing was wrong and quickly excused themselves. Lancelot turned to Blake and told him to try not to cause trouble. Blake apologized to Lancelot and thanked him for intervening. As Lancelot walked away, he silently observed Blake and thought to himself that Blake didn't seem like someone who could defeat Gunther. He wondered if Blake was hiding his true abilities. 14 days later, they finally arrived at a nearby village that had been destroyed. As Lancelot inspected the area, the village chief approached him, reporting that nearby villages had recently been attacked by monsters. The villagers were terrified that they would be next. The chief then began to cry, pleading with Lancelot to defeat the monsters. Lancelot remained silent, carefully considering a plan. Outside, the trainees were finally allowed to take a break. Blake approached the group and told them they were back. Sven apologized to him for leaving the squad leader duties to him. Before Blake could reply, the instructor called for all squad leaders to gather around. During the meeting, Lancelot informed the squad leaders that the village chief was lying. He pointed out that some of the houses were burned and that he hadn't seen any young women in the village. From this, he deduced that the villagers were likely already under threat from the monsters. The squad leaders praised Lancelot for seeing through the truth so quickly. Lancelot continued, advising them not to eat or drink anything from the village as a precaution. He warned that the monsters would likely attack during the night and announced his plan to ambush them. He then asked the leaders if they had any objections. Smiling, one of the leaders replied, "How could we object to Captain Lancelot's decision?" Lancelot simply acknowledged their response and was about to explain his plan when someone interrupted. The group turned to see Blake stepping forward, asking if he could say something. The squad leader shouted at Blake, warning him not to get cocky and demanding to know how he dared to give his opinion to the captain. They accused him of being incredibly presumptuous. Lancelot silenced them, saying it was enough, and walked past the squad leaders to face Blake. He told them it didn't matter if Blake was a rookie. He wanted to hear his honest opinion. Blake explained to Lancelot that with the current strategy, they probably wouldn't be able to save the hostages who had been captured. He suggested they needed to take an offensive approach as well. Lancelot reminded him that they didn't know where the enemy was located and asked if Blake intended to search until bedtime. Blake confidently replied, "Yes." The senior squad leaders shouted in anger, saying there was no way he could conduct a search in such a short time and adding that the villagers wouldn't cooperate in their current state. Blake remained calm and told them they could search if they used the detection barrier technique. One of the seniors asked, "What is a detection barrier technique?" Blake demonstrated it, explaining that it was a barrier technique capable of detecting targets within a certain range. By transforming the barrier into particle form, it could grasp the shape and movement of objects it touched. He added that the technique could detect not just people and monsters, but anything with a physical form. Despite his explanation, one of the seniors grabbed him by the collar in anger, shouting that he was lying. The senior insisted that barrier techniques were only capable of creating barriers and could never have detection abilities. Remaining composed, Blake closed his eyes and cast the technique. Without looking back, he calmly stated, "One of you is yawning and the other is drinking," referring to the two seniors behind him. The seniors were shocked and demanded to know how he knew that. Still unable to believe him, they accused him of being in cahoots with others. Fortunately, Lancelot intervened, assigning Blake's squad the task of locating the monster's lair and rescuing the hostages. The senior leaders were stunned and furious, but Lancelot explained that involving rookies in the attack wouldn't change the situation. Instead, assigning them a task with even a slight possibility of success was more logical. Lancelot then loudly announced that the operation would begin at night during bedtime. He ordered the leaders to give instructions to their squads, and they all replied with a firm yes. Later that night, Blake and his squad walked through the forest. Sven, excited, told him he couldn't believe Lancelot had entrusted such an important role to rookies. He remarked that Lancelot was certainly taking a bold move. However, Therese disagreed, saying it was the opposite. Lancelot probably believed they wouldn't succeed. Clara nervously asked Blake if he could find the monsters with his power. He replied with a simple yes, but added that the range of his detection barrier technique wasn't very wide, so they would need to move around a bit. Sven marveled at him, saying, "You're still an extraordinary old man." Therese, however, remarked that she wasn't even surprised anymore. Clara silently stared at Blake, thinking to herself how amazing he was. She was equally impressed by his barrier techniques. When she was with him, her heart raced and she felt a sense of excitement she couldn't explain. On the other hand, in the village, the squad members were sleeping on the carriage, while in one of the houses, Lancelot lay in bed, seemingly asleep. Monsters armed with knives crept into the house and slowly approached him. They raised their knives, aiming to strike and strike down in unison. However, before they could touch him, one of the monsters was hurled out of the house. Lancelot stood up from his feigned slumber, wondering aloud why there were only a few level 3 lizardmen. He thought they were underestimating him. Minutes later, explosions rocked the houses in the village as the squad members fought the lizardmen, mocking them as weaklings. Their taunts ceased when they heard the sound of heavy footsteps. Turning, they were shocked to see level 4 orcs approaching. One of the orcs charged forward, swinging its massive hammer. The hammer struck 2 magicians in the back, sending them flying. They crashed to the ground, cursing as the orcs closed in. Just as the orc seemed unstoppable, a powerful fire spell struck the lead orc in the face. It was Lancelot. He asked the magicians where the other monsters were. They thanked him, but one of the magicians, trembling with fear, told Lancelot to look behind him. When he turned, he saw the level 6 orc lord looming over him. The magician, recognizing the strength of a level 6 monster, stutteringly shouted to the others not to worry because they had the invincible Captain Lancelot. Lancelot leapt into the air, gathering air magic in his left hand and fire magic in his right. He aimed at the Orc Lord and released both spells simultaneously. The combined magic engulfed the Orc Lord and its orcs, reducing them to ashes. Lancelot continued channeling his overpowering magic until there was no trace of the monsters left. Once satisfied, he landed safely on the ground. The senior magicians cheered loudly, shouting that Lancelot was as amazing as they expected. However, Lancelot remained silent, sensing that the monsters were unusually well prepared. He deduced that there must be a commander, as an Orc Lord shouldn't possess such intelligence. Suddenly, Lancelot froze in shock, and the others were paralyzed with fear as they saw a new monster approaching. Meanwhile, nearby, Blake and his squad found the missing women and children in a cave. They quickly untied them, assuring them they were safe and that everything would be all right. However, Blake suddenly felt an ominous presence. Without hesitation, he rushed outside, shouting to his team that he would leave the rest to them. Back in the village, the approaching monster spoke to Lancelot, who remained frozen in shock. The monster mockingly asked Lancelot what was wrong and if he was powerless before it. Lancelot stared at the enormous Barbarossa standing before him. Some senior magicians backed away, murmuring that Barbarossa might be a level 8 monster due to its immense strength. Others dismissed their fears, shouting that there was no way their captain could lose. Barbarossa starts swinging around its massive axes at Lancelot while taunting him, asking if this was all the strength the captain of the Royal Magician Corps' 1st Division could muster. Lancelot remained silent, realizing that he had used up a significant amount of his magical power in the previous battle. He calculated that he could only cast one more high-level spell. If he missed, it would be over. He wondered anxiously what he should do. Despite his doubts, the senior magicians shouted their unwavering confidence, declaring that Lancelot would definitely defeat the giant with ease. Lancelot dodged Barbarossa's attacks, steeling himself with the thought that he was the invincible Lancelot and couldn't lose to anyone. However, Barbarossa timed his jump perfectly and struck him, slamming him into the ground with such force that it caused an explosion. The impact left the other magicians calling out to him in worry. Barbarossa raised its axe, declaring that it was over. It swung the weapon down with tremendous force, shattering the ground beneath. Barbarossa grinned, thinking it had secured victory, only to be stunned when it saw Blake standing in front of it, blocking the attack. Blake calmly said, "Looks like he made it in time." The senior magicians were in disbelief as they witnessed Blake stopping Barbarossa's massive axe. They questioned aloud what was happening, unable to comprehend the scene before them. Blake turned to Lancelot, offering to heal his wounds. Raising both hands, he began to mend Lancelot's injuries. Lancelot, shocked by the unexpected display, asked if it was holy magic, given that he thought Blake could only use barrier techniques. Blake explained that it was a healing barrier technique, utilizing the purification and detection properties of barriers to stimulate the body and promote regeneration. Barbarossa, enraged by the scene, demanded to know how they dared to casually converse in front of him. It cursed them while repeatedly striking the barrier. Blake helped Lancelot to his feet and inquired about their chances of victory. Lancelot admitted that high-level magic could secure their success, but it required time to charge. and Barbarossa's vigilance could render it ineffective. Blake assured Lancelot that he would create an opening, causing Lancelot to question whether he planned to rely solely on defensive barriers. Lancelot expressed concern that Barbarossa would notice the high-level magic being prepared. Blake dismissed the concern, stating that he intended to fight, leaving Lancelot astonished and questioning how a defensive barrier technique could be used in combat. Blake brought his hands together, channeling energy to create a soft barrier around his feet. He positioned himself carefully before leaping with the enhanced strength of the barrier-augmented jump. As he soared, he cast a large magic circle ahead of him and pierced through it, coating his body in a sharp and thick barrier. Barbarossa, noticing the attack, attempted to evade, but it got struck so hard that rolled in the air, before crushing into the ground hard, leaving the senior magician stunned and questioning whether he had truly managed to knock down the giant monster. Barbarossa quickly recovered, warning Blake not to get overconfident. However, before Barbarossa could react further, Blake appeared in front of it with blinding speed. His fist, encased in a hardened barrier, struck Barbarossa square in the face. Blake then shouted for Lancelot to act. Without hesitation, Lancelot gathered his remaining magic, unleashing an overwhelming attack with both hands aimed at Barbarossa. The combined power engulfed the monster, burning it alive. Barbarossa roared in agony before collapsing, lifeless. The magicians erupted into cheers, celebrating their victory over the enormous foe. Lancelot, exhausted, descended to the ground and remarked that they had somehow managed to succeed. However, fatigue overtook him, and he began to collapse. Blake caught him just in time, helping him remain upright. Blake commended Lancelot's incredible magic, and Lancelot returned the praise. One of the magicians, however, interjected with excitement, exclaiming that Lancelot was invincible and his magic was unmatched. Others echoed the sentiment, claiming that Lancelot could have easily won without Blake's involvement and accusing Blake of attempting to steal the glory. Lancelot, frustrated, began to defend Blake, but Blake interrupted. He insisted that maybe Lancelot could have achieved victory on his own, surprising Lancelot. Addressing the magicians, Blake reminded them that Lancelot was human, not perfect, and that no matter how strong he was, he remained mortal. Blake questioned whether comrades should not fight together and support one another. One of the magicians, angered by Blake's remarks, grabbed him by the collar and accused him of mocking Lancelot. Blake calmly grabs the man's hand, firmly tightening it. He stated that he understood the pain of fighting alone and the comfort of having allies. Blake added that there was no such thing as a flawless human, and that Lancelot, like anyone else, was a person with a heart. The magician, visibly unsettled, withdrew and left in anger. Blake sighed, clearly frustrated by the situation. Later, the hostages were safely returned to the village. The village chief, admitting to being threatened, apologized for his earlier actions. Despite the resolution, the true identity of Barbarossa remained unknown, leaving an ominous shadow over the events. Days later, back in the kingdom, Sven cried tears of joy, shouting about finally returning. Therese, equally emotional, remarked on how long and exhausting the journey had been. Clara vowed never to join another expedition. As they headed toward their dormitory, someone called out to Blake, requesting a moment of his time. In a small pub, Lancelot apologized for the sudden invitation and asked Blake if it was inconvenient. Blake reassured him, expressing happiness at being invited to a meal for the first time. Lancelot, speaking softly, revealed that it was the same for him. When Blake asked him to repeat himself, Lancelot, somewhat embarrassed, admitted that this was his first time inviting someone. Blake found the coincidence amusing and remarked that they were both first-timers. Lancelot agreed, suggesting that since they were off-duty, Blake could drop the formalities and address him by name. Blake agreed, reciprocating by asking Lancelot to call him by his name as well. Raising his mug, Lancelot proposed a toast, to which Blake replied with enthusiasm, suggesting it be for the two of a kind. Lancelot added that it was for two imperfect people. They clinked their mugs together, laughing and chatting like old friends. For the first time in a long while, Lancelot felt the weight of his worries lift. And thanks to Blake, he was able to smile like a carefree child. The next day, he walked down the street, stretching his arms and smiling. It had been a while since he'd had a full day off, and he thought to himself how nice it was to walk around town alone sometimes. As he strolled, he reflected on everything that had happened recently. For a time, he hadn't been sure how things would turn out. But thanks to Alice, he now had his current life. Lost in thought about how he needed to thank Alice, someone suddenly ran toward him. Before he realized it, a lady accidentally bumped into him. They both immediately apologized, and he worriedly asked her if she was hurt. When he looked at her face, he froze in recognition. Just as he was about to say her name, she grabbed his hand and pulled him away without explanation. A moment later, the Kingdom Knights appeared nearby, questioning each other about whether they had found their target. Unable to locate her, they ran off, speculating about where she could have gone. Once the knights were out of sight, the lady sighed in relief. She turned to him, apologizing for dragging him into the situation. She explained that the knights had been incredibly persistent. Removing her cape, she revealed her face fully, and he couldn't help but smile as he recognized her. It was Alice. Cheerfully, she greeted him, saying it had been a while, and mentioning that she had heard about his achievements. Embarrassed, he replied that he hadn't done anything special. Curious, he asked why she was being chased. Alice hesitated for a moment before proudly admitting that she was running away from her responsibilities. She explained that preparations for the Demon King's defeat celebration were underway, along with countless other events she was being forced to participate in. She went on to complain about having to meet hundreds of important people, create endless documents, and respond to fan letters. He stuttered a response, commenting that it all sounded tough, but Alice quickly shot back that the word tough didn't even begin to describe it. She added that Etta and the others had also been called to help but didn't have nearly as much work as she did. Frustrated, she lamented that as the hero, her workload was nothing short of murderous, and that the others seemed to be trying to work her to death. She finally declared that she'd had enough and didn't care what happened anymore. Seeing her frustration, he thought to himself that Alice needed a change of pace. He interrupted her complaints, calling her name and asking if she wanted to hang out with him. Alice seemed surprised, asking if it was really okay. He reassured her that it was, adding that she had done a lot for him and that he wanted to thank her properly. At first, Alice seemed taken aback by his offer, but after a brief moment, her expression brightened. She enthusiastically agreed, visibly excited by the idea. A little while later, they arrived at a picturesque spot. He looked around in awe, remarking that he hadn't known such a place existed near the royal capital. Alice, clearly proud, revealed that it was her favorite spot and that she often came there when she wanted to be alone. Hesitant, he asked if it was really okay for him to intrude on such a personal place. Alice dismissed his concern with a simple response, telling him it was fine because he was special. She then pulled something out of her bag, announcing that her lunchbox was making its appearance. He opened it to find a perfect sandwich layered with egg, burger patty, tomato, special sauce, and lettuce. Amazed, he commented on how delicious it looked. Alice, with a hint of pride, told him that she had made it herself. Noticing there were 2 sandwiches, he asked why there were extras. Alice stammered in response, brushing off the question and telling him to just eat it. Smiling, he decided not to press further and took a bite. The taste surprised him, and he happily told her that the sandwich was delicious and that she was a good cook. Alice, pleased with his compliment, remarked that she might not look it, but she was quite domestic. She then asked if it seemed odd for a hero to have such skills. He quickly assured her that he didn't find it strange at all, putting her at ease. Alice began to share her past with him, explaining that before becoming a hero, she was just a simple village girl living in a rundown village. She described herself as an ordinary girl who was handy and good at housework, but lacked any special powers. One day, however, everything changed when she received a revelation and the blessing of the goddess Altria. From that moment on, she became a hero. She explained that heroes who received such a revelation were tasked with defeating the Demon King, which meant she had to undergo harsh training. Having never held a sword before, her palms became blistered and calloused during those grueling days. He listened attentively, simply replying that he understood. Standing up, she proclaimed herself pretty amazing, recounting how she discovered that swordsmanship was actually quite enjoyable once she tried it. She added that she grew stronger in no time, smiling at him as she suggested that perhaps it was natural talent. He agreed, telling her that he believed she must have some innate ability to become that strong. Looking up at the bright blue sky, she reflected on how tough it had been. The training was hard, the enemies were formidable, and her companions were few. Yet through relentless effort, she had managed to defeat the Demon King. She noted that there were fewer monsters now. The greatest threat was gone, and peace was the best outcome. She asked him if he agreed that it meant everyone could smile now. Though she still wore a smile, there was a sadness in her expression, as she added that she was still a hero. He stood next to her and began to speak about himself, referring to his past as a barrier mage. For 30 years, he had maintained barriers, an old man who felt left behind by the times and out of touch with the world. Alice was taken aback by his sudden self-deprecating tone, stammering as she asked if he was joking. In response, he explained that even someone like him had beliefs and that there were things only he could do. He then told her that he wanted to protect her, leaving her shy and stunned by the declaration. He explained further that the reason he had maintained barriers against the demon realm for so long was because he wanted to protect everyone, and the same sentiment applied to her. Alice hesitated before asking why he felt the need to protect her, considering she was a hero, the strongest human. He told her it didn't matter whether she was a hero or not. To him, she was simply herself, a kind, cheerful, hardworking, caring, and wonderful person. Alice paused, visibly moved, and admitted she understood now what he meant. Thanking him, she assured him that she was okay, saying she had just been feeling a little frustrated. He replied with a simple acknowledgement, saying he understood. Later, they returned to the street. Alice stopped and told him they had gone far enough, thanking him for the day. He waved goodbye, suggesting that if she ever wanted, they should go somewhere together again. She agreed with a smile, saying she looked forward to it as she walked away. As he stood there watching her, he failed to notice someone lurking nearby. Hidden at the corner of a building, Gunther glared at him with pure anger. Under his breath, Gunther repeatedly cursed him and wished for his demise, his face twisted in hatred. Hours ago, Gunther had asked the man what he had said, and the man told him that he was being transferred to the Mabel region. Gunther shouted at him, calling it a demotion, and demanded to know what on earth he was thinking. The man shouted back that Gunther had gone too far, repeated misconduct, abuse of authority, and even causing problems in the training unit. Frustrated, the man yelled that he had reached his limit covering for Gunther. Gunther, furious, reminded the man that he was a high-ranking nobleman and an excellent magician. The man, however, pushed Gunther's hand away and coldly replied that it didn't matter anymore. He was cutting ties with him. This infuriated Gunther further, and he shouted that after all the benefits he had given the man, he was now being betrayed. The man stood up and replied that teaming up with Gunther had been a mistake, and he never expected Gunther to act so foolishly. As the man walked away, he told Gunther to start over in the borderlands. Gunther tried to stop him, but the man left the room, leaving Gunther shouting in frustration. Enraged, Gunther kicked a table repeatedly, asking if they were truly cutting him off. When he emerged from the room, he was a mess, and the other magicians nearby noticed. They whispered among themselves, teasingly remarking that Gunther had brought it upon himself and that it was the end for someone so despised. Hearing this, Gunther was enraged and shouted at them to shut up. He released powerful fire magic in his anger, injuring the magicians around him, and called them worthless scum. As a result, Gunther was forcibly thrown out of the kingdom. He protested, shouting that he was a high-ranking nobleman and essential to the country. But the man who escorted him out furiously replied that Gunther should be grateful he wasn't in prison and was only being discharged. Gunther shouted in disbelief, demanding to know why he was being treated like this. The man, however, turned his back and slammed the Magician Kingdom's gates in his face, leaving Gunther kneeling on the ground as ordinary people gathered to watch. Gunther, in his despair, remembered something and thought that Alice would understand his worth. He had fallen in love with Alice at first sight and dreamed of fighting by her side. He aimed for the position of captain, hoping she would notice his charm. But then, one day, Blake appeared and took Alice's attention. Gunther became convinced that Blake was the root of all his problems. Determined, Gunther stood up, wondering where Alice was. He pushed past people without caring if he bumped into them, intent on finding her. His steps faltered when he saw Alice smiling brightly. He was happy to see her and was about to call out to her, but then he froze in shock. Blake was with her. They were happily chatting, and Gunther could only ask himself why. He thought that it should have been him in Blake's place. At that moment, Gunther's dreams of chatting with Alice, making her smile because of him, and eventually being with her, shattered. Seeing Alice's happiness with Blake, Gunther cursed him and wished for his death. His despair turned into a twisted determination as he thought of killing Blake and taking Alice for himself, laughing like a demon as he convinced himself that Alice had been his from the start. The next day, the instructor ordered everyone to line up. The units assembled, and Sven noticed the formation as Lancelot stepped forward to announce their roles. Lancelot informed them that their mission would be to guard VIPs in the city during the upcoming Demon King subjugation ceremony. He began to assign positions, pulling documents from his folder. While Lancelot was busy giving assignments, Therese asked Blake where he thought their unit would be placed. Blake replied that they would likely be stationed at the castle gate since they were just trainees. When Lancelot announced the escort for Lady Hero Alice and her party, Clara quietly commented to Sven that she expected their group would be assigned to patrol duty. Sven nodded in agreement. As Lancelot finished assigning positions, Sven noticed that many magicians in the line were staring directly at their group. Puzzled, he asked why they were looking at them. Clara hesitated for a moment before replying, "It's us." Therese, confused, asked what Clara meant by us. Clara, visibly shocked, explained, "We're the ones escorting Lady Hero Alice and her party." The group was completely in utter disbelief, unable to believe what they had just heard. Everyone was in silence to hear the announcement and stared at them. One of the senior magicians stepped forward and asked if the trainees were truly going to be the escorts for Lady Hero Alice and her companions. He argued that there must have been some mistake. Lancelot firmly confirmed the decision, explaining that it was a recommendation from both Alice and himself. He noted that the trainees had performed admirably during the recent monster attack. Additionally, Blake had the notable achievement of defeating the former vice captain Gunther, and was trusted by both Alice and Edda. The other magicians agreed that Blake was strong enough to fight alongside Lancelot himself, as they had witnessed Blake's power firsthand. Lancelot ended the debate with a commanding tone, announcing that the decision was final and ordering everyone to focus on their respective duties. Reluctantly, they all agreed, having no other choice. A moment later, the three trainees stood outside a grand room, both nervous and excited at the prospect of meeting Lady Hero Alice. Sven admitted that he felt like he was going to throw up from nervousness. Therese scolded him to get himself together, and Clara added that he was being unsightly. However, Sven noticed that both girls' feet were shaking as well. Choosing not to say anything, he exhaled deeply in an attempt to relax. Summoning his courage, Sven grabbed the doorknob and declared they had no choice but to enter. He opened the door while politely excusing himself and the others. Inside, they were greeted with warm smiles from Alice and Edda, who cheerfully told them they had been waiting. The three were starstruck by the beauty of the heroes. Sven could hardly believe he was seeing the real Alice and Edda. Therese thought they were wonderful ladies, while Clara likened them to goddesses. Their awe deepened when they saw Blake casually apologize to Alice and Edda for keeping them waiting. Alice, excited, praised Blake for his heroic efforts during the monster attack, while Etta winked at him, saying she had expected no less from him. The trainees, watching the exchange, confirmed to themselves that Blake and the heroes were clearly well acquainted and seemed close. After a few minutes of greetings, they all sat down for a formal conversation. The trainees sat stiffly, overwhelmed with nervousness, while Blake remained calm. Alice noticed their discomfort and gently told them not to be so tense. Etta playfully added that they weren't going to eat them. Therese observed that both Alice and Etta seemed kind, but she found the knight standing behind Alice intimidating. Blake took the opportunity to ask if it was true that Alice and Etta had recommended them. Alice confirmed it, while Etta said she was confident in her abilities. Etta's secretary added with a warm smile that it was reassuring to have Blake there. Clara, watching this, realized just how highly Blake was regarded. She thought to herself that Blake wasn't an ordinary person. Meanwhile, Sven and Therese, similarly impressed, thought they had understood how great Blake was, but now they realized his reputation exceeded their imagination. They stared at Blake, who remained composed, in amazement. The captain of the knights stepped forward and asked Alice if he could make a suggestion. Alice nodded and asked what it was. The knight then remarked that, while Blake might be capable, the other three lacked the air of strong individuals. He commented that they looked like novice magicians and suggested replacing them with more experienced ones. Sven and Therese, though silently acknowledging the knight's criticism, felt dejected. Clara, however, refused to back down. Seeing Blake's warm, encouraging smile, she stood up and boldly declared that they could do it. Inspired by Clara's courage, Sven and Therese stood up as well, shouting that the knight couldn't judge their abilities without seeing them in action. The knight sighed and calmly suggested testing them to see if they were worthy. They moved to an open training ground for the test. The knight explained the rules. If they could land a single attack on him, they would win. He also promised not to use magic, giving them a handicap. Sven, irritated by the knight's condescending tone, released his fire magic in frustration. Therese, equally annoyed, joined him in launching a combined attack while shouting at the knight to take them seriously. However, just a few minutes later, all three trainees were on the ground, exhausted and bruised. The knight, standing unscathed, mockingly asked if they were done already. Sven realized that the knight had dodged every single attack effortlessly. The knight explained that he had been trained by Walburga, the sword saint, and there was no way ordinary magicians could defeat him. Alice and Etta, watching from the side, silently agreed. Alice noted that the knight was part of the hero's vanguard and had been trained by a genius. Etta added that Walburga was highly skilled in countering magicians, making victory nearly impossible for the trainees. The knight declared that he couldn't entrust the escort duty to powerless magicians. Before the trainees could despair, Blake calmly asked Alice how many days remained until the ceremony. Alice replied that it was exactly 3 weeks. Blake then proposed to the knight that if the trainees became stronger within 3 weeks, they should be reevaluated. The knight agreed, but added that he would test them 3 days before the ceremony. Blake thanked him and turned to the trainees. Looking at them seriously, Blake asked what they planned to do. Sven immediately shouted that they would do it. Therese declared that they wouldn't give up, and Clara promised that they would pass no matter what. Alice and Etta, excited by their determination, cheered them on, which calmed the trainees and gave them confidence. The captain of the vanguard, watching from a distance, silently wondered what could be accomplished in just 3 weeks. He resolved to keep an eye on their progress. Meanwhile, Sven encouraged his team to give it their all, and Therese added that they would complete any training, no matter how hard it was. The next day, in Mecha Forest, the trainees encountered strong armed monsters. Despite their determination from the previous day, they were now running for their lives, screaming, "We don't want to die." Therese shouted in horror that there was no way they could defeat a level 3 monster, while Clara shouted that it was a strategic retreat. Blake, hovering in the air and standing on a barrier, called out for them to do their best. However, Sven shouted back that it was impossible. Blake told them they wouldn't get stronger by running away. This angered Sven, who abruptly stopped running and turned around. Fueled by frustration, Sven launched a fire attack at the monsters, making them scream in pain. One of the monsters jumped at Sven, attempting to smash him to death, but he narrowly jumped away in time to dodge the blow. The lizard glared at them in fury. Therese asked if she was right in thinking the attack wasn't very effective, and Sven questioned what they were supposed to do. Blake shouted to them that they needed to figure it out themselves. Otherwise, there was no point. Sven responded that even if Blake said that, they couldn't do it. Suddenly, the monster appeared behind Sven, ready to bite his head. Fortunately, a barrier materialized just in time to defend him. Blake reassured them, saying he would protect them when things got tough. He then released a stronger barrier to block the other monsters and shouted to them that they could do it. Therese realized they needed to be prepared. Sven agreed, but asked how they were supposed to do that. Clara reminded them of Blake's earlier words. He couldn't train their magic directly since he specialized in barrier techniques, but he did know basic training principles. Sven asked Blake what they should do, and Blake replied that they needed to use the cards they already had in their hand. Sven and Therese understood what he meant. Clara then used her power to enhance Sven and Therese's physical abilities. One of the monsters attempted to decapitate Therese with its scythe, but she dodged and shouted that it wouldn't hit her. Sven aimed at the monster's side and unleashed a powerful burst of fire, burning it and causing it to scream in pain. Therese then targeted its opposite side and shouted for it not to get distracted before slashing the monster into pieces with her magic. Excited by their victory, they decided to keep the momentum going. Blake smiled as he watched them, knowing that teamwork multiplies their strength, especially when they get along well. He was confident they would grow even stronger. The next day, on day 2 of training, they climbed a mountain while dragging a pile of huge rocks behind them. Blake explained that strength and stamina were the foundations of combat. On day 3, he instructed them to try hitting him with their powers. While dodging their attacks, he lectured them on reading their opponent's movements and understanding their own capabilities. Days passed. With each session, they grew stronger and became more attuned to their own magic. By the end of their training, they were far more capable than when they had started. 3 days before the ceremony, they gathered again at the training ground. The knight informed them that it was time to begin the re-examination. They responded with pride, declaring that they were different now and would not lose, that they would win this time. The knight took note of their excessive confidence and wondered if Blake had encouraged them. He thought to himself that false confidence held no value, as reality would soon confront them. Sven struck first, aiming his hand at the knight and releasing a powerful burst of fire. The knight easily cut through the flames with his sword, telling them it was useless. However, Therese suddenly appeared in front of him and declared that it wasn't useless. She released her magic at him, but he dodged and countered with a sword thrust, telling her again that it was futile. Fortunately, she dodged the attack just in time. The knight had believed his attack would land, but then noticed Clara enhancing their physical abilities. He smiled, acknowledging to himself that it was not bad teamwork. Moments later, Sven and Therese continued attacking him, doing their best to land even a single blow. Despite Clara's ongoing support through enhancement magic, the knight kept dodging and deflecting their strikes with ease. Eventually, they stopped, panting and exhausted, having expected the knight to be this strong. The knight asked if that was all they had, but they ignored him. Sven then urged the others that they should go for it. Therese agreed, knowing they had no other option, and Clara declared that it was all or nothing. All 3 dashed toward the knight at once, surrounding him from different directions. They each raised a hand toward him and shouted that they were using their newly acquired magic. Together, they unleashed their magic power. The knight was shocked to realize that the magic they had just released was at an intermediate level. Panicking, the knight immediately swung his sword around to deflect the incoming attacks. Fortunately for him, he managed to dodge every blast and emerged unscathed. Sven cursed loudly, seeing that their final attempt had failed. From the sidelines, Alice announced that it was over. Sven looked down at his trembling hands and body and told the others they were completely out of magical power. Therese admitted defeat, frustrated by the outcome. Blake, however, reminded them that they had grown that strong in just 3 weeks, and they should be proud of what they had achieved. The knight then walked toward them and stated that they had all passed, leaving them confused. Sven asked why, since they had clearly lost. The knight revealed that their magic had been impressive, and then, without them noticing, he turned slightly, exposing a crack in his armor, indicating that one of their attacks had indeed landed. He knelt down to their level and told them that they had grown remarkably strong over the past 3 weeks, and he was confident they would be fine. The words moved them deeply. Blake proudly congratulated them, and the group excitedly gathered around him, shouting with joy that they did it, that their hard work had paid off. Alice turned to Edda and commented that they looked like masters and disciples. Edda responded that it was a good relationship. Alice then said that with Blake's team, the ceremony should be safe. Edda, however, noted that there had been some unsettling rumors, and she hoped everything would proceed smoothly. Unaware that Gunther was already lurking near the castle, fuming with rage and ready to take his revenge. On the day of the Demon King's subjugation ceremony, people gathered along the roadside, cheering as Alice and Edda waved to them. The 3 young bodyguards walked ahead on the road, noticing the massive crowd. The sight made them realize the weight of their responsibility. They had to guard the heroes properly and couldn't afford to let their guard down. Blake, who was walking beside Alice and Edda, noticed that Alice's 2 companions were riding in the dragon carriage behind them. He silently hoped they were doing well too. Alice, visibly excited, suggested they have a chat, which Edda agreed to. However, Blake declined, reminding them that they should focus on their mission. Though both girls reluctantly agreed, he knew that failure was not an option. He recalled a moment earlier when the knight had informed them that the lives of the hero and her companions were being targeted. There had been repeated assassination attempts on aides and kidnapping incidents, highlighting the importance of their presence. They were to protect them with their lives, and every knight and guard had agreed to that duty. Returning to the present, Blake scanned the surroundings with heightened vigilance, unaware that within the crowd, Gunther was lurking, his eyes burning with hatred. Seeing Blake beside Alice infuriated him further, and he muttered under his breath, calling Blake a worthless piece of trash. Suddenly, Gunther lunged forward and leapt onto the road, blocking their path. Blake turned, trying to confirm whether it was truly Gunther. The knight rushed forward, and the chief issued an immediate order to capture Gunther and show no mercy if he resisted. However, Gunther snapped, shouting that Alice belonged to him and that he would kill Blake. When one of the guards tried to restrain Gunther from behind, warning him not to move, Gunther turned with rage and incinerated the knight, shouting at him to stay back. The horrific scene shocked and terrified the citizens, who now realized Gunther was a magician. Screams erupted as people ran for their lives, while Gunther silently watched the knight burn. Just then, Edda appeared behind Gunther and aimed her wand, releasing a blast of cold water that extinguished the flames, saving the burning knight. At the same time, Therese and Sven charged at Gunther in fury, while Clara rushed to heal the wounded knight. Sven grabbed Gunther in a chokehold from behind, while Therese pinned his waist. Gunther shouted at them to let him go, calling them foolish commoners, but they held him down, forcing him to the ground. Gunther, still resisting, unleashed his firepower, setting Sven's arm ablaze. Screaming that if Alice wouldn't be his, he would burn everything, he hurled a powerful fire attack toward the heroes. Alice remained calm as Blake rushed forward and raised his barrier to protect them, shielding them from the blast. Furious, Gunther cursed him, calling him a damn barrier mage. As the flames dissipated, Blake lowered his barrier and calmly approached Gunther. Alice, her voice tinged with sadness, asked Gunther why he was doing this, but Gunther screamed at her not to be deceived by Blake and demanded that she return to him. He then shouted that they should talk about love, referencing a supposed day when they had confessed their feelings to each other. Alice, visibly confused, asked what he was talking about, pointing out that they had hardly ever spoken. The knight approached and handcuffed Gunther, who continued screaming that he and Alice loved each other and begged for her love again. The knight dragged him away as he struggled and yelled incoherently. Edda quietly wondered if Gunther could no longer distinguish between reality and delusion, thinking that he was pitiful. Alice noticed Blake staring at Gunther and hurriedly explained to him that she had never dated anyone and never had the time for such things, leaving Blake slightly confused. Edda then pointed out that the citizens were beginning to gather again. Alice turned to the crowd and assured them that the attacker had been captured. Edda added that they could now relax. The crowd, reassured by their words, calmed down and began cheering again, impressed by the heroic response from the escort team. The parade continued, and excitement returned to the streets. Alice and Edda felt relieved and told Blake that they were glad to have requested escorts. Blake smiled and replied that he had simply put up a barrier. Alice then asked him if she was right in thinking that the kids were quite skilled too. Blake responded that while others might call them dropouts, he believed they were excellent. They just hadn't realized it yet. A short while later, after the public parade, Sven was awestruck by the grand venue filled with nobles. Therese told him to calm down, while Clara chided him, saying he was being embarrassing. Sven sheepishly asked what was wrong with being happy, saying it was because the hero and her party had done so well at the ceremony. Blake reminded them that it was they who had been invited, and Sven proudly agreed. The nobles began to glance in their direction, making Therese blush and whisper that they were attracting attention. Sven, still proud, remarked that they did stand out. At that moment, Alice approached them and said she wondered if everyone was enjoying themselves. As they turned around, they were all stunned. Alice and Edda, now wearing elegant dresses and makeup, stood before them, radiant and breathtaking. All eyes were on Alice and Edda. The nobles admired them, thinking they were both beautiful and elegant. Blake turned to them and commented that they looked great together and were absolutely gorgeous. Alice shyly asked if he truly thought so, while Edda quietly thanked him with a blush. Just then, Lancelot appeared and told Blake that it seemed he had done quite well out there. Blake humbly replied that Sven and the others had done far better than he had, prompting Lancelot to glance over at them. Sven and Therese, proudly agreeing, told Lancelot that Blake was just being modest. Clara, observing her friends getting cocky so quickly, quietly noted it to herself. Lancelot then turned to Clara and told her she had handled things wonderfully too, which caused her to blush and look away, flattered. She stammered that Blake was praising her too much. Alice, curious, asked when Blake had gotten so close to Lancelot. Edda commented that it was an unexpected pairing, but Blake and Lancelot simply looked at each other with a knowing smile and shared a laugh. As the group happily chatted, the kids devoured their food with enthusiasm, while some of the nearby nobles watched them curiously. One noble asked aloud if those were the heroes' escorts, and commented that they looked rather shabby and out of place. Blake noticed their stares and began to feel slightly uncomfortable. Looking around, he asked where the other two were. Alice clarified that he was referring to Val and Rua Hermina. Edda explained that Walburga wasn't attending the event, and Hermina had wandered off somewhere, surrounded by gentlemen. Blake mentioned he wanted to greet them, and Alice reassured him that he'd meet them eventually. Soon after, the music began, and the nobles started dancing. Blake noticed Alice approaching and taking his hand, urging him to dance. Before he could protest, she pulled him onto the floor. He tried to explain that he didn't know how to dance, but once they were in position, Alice winked and told him to just follow her lead. He was startled at first, but as Alice smiled warmly at him, he followed her steps. Gradually, he relaxed and began to enjoy the dance. Edda and Clara watched them with a twinge of jealousy, while Sven and Therese cheered loudly for them. After the dance with Alice, Blake turned to Edda, extended his hand, and asked if he could have that dance. Etta happily accepted, clearly thrilled to dance with him. Lancelot watched the scene and smiled warmly. Alice noticed his expression and teased that she couldn't believe Lancelot could smile like that. Lancelot admitted that he was surprised himself, adding that perhaps he had changed after meeting Blake. He remarked that Blake was a mysterious man. Alice nodded and said she understood. She believed Blake was a special person, and those around him were changed for better or worse. Lancelot asked if she was referring to Gunther and called him a pitiful man. Alice then asked what would happen to Gunther. Lancelot replied that he would likely be executed. At that moment, Gunther sat in his prison cell, laughing like a madman who had completely lost his mind. Alice quietly acknowledged Lancelot's words. He explained that Gunther had simply been consumed by obsession, and the object of that obsession wasn't to blame. Alice agreed and thanked Lancelot for his kind words. A few days later, the knight, Etta's people, Blake, Lancelot, and the kids gathered outside the castle to see the heroes off. Blake remarked that while the ceremony had just ended, the party was already heading off on an expedition to another country, and it sounded tough. Alice responded with a small smile, saying that it was the fate of the heroes' party. They had to report the Demon King's defeat and everything else. Etta added that the trip also served to showcase Hendria Kingdom's strength, though she would have preferred to be researching barrier magic instead. Blake advised them to be careful on their journey. Alice told him that if anything happened in the royal capital, he should take care of it. He replied confidently that he would. Etta then stepped closer to him and motioned for him to bend down. He leaned in, and she whispered that when she returned, she wanted to be able to rely on him again. He immediately agreed and gently patted her head, an action that shocked the kids watching. Alice and Etta boarded the carriage and waved goodbye, calling out that they were off. Blake called back, wishing them a safe journey. They all stood together, watching the carriage roll into the distance until it disappeared from sight. Lancelot then commented that it was the first time the heroes' party had left the royal capital since defeating the Demon King. He admitted he hoped nothing bad would happen. Meanwhile, deep inside the prison, Gunther sat alone, laughing uncontrollably, and was up to something no good. Several weeks later, the students were training in the courtyard under the sun. The instructor called an end to the session, prompting sighs of relief from Sven, Therese, and Clara. Each of them was drenched in sweat, their stamina pushed to its limit. Blake approached and offered praise for their effort. Sven, while catching his breath, wondered aloud why they hadn't been sent on missions lately, as the routine had been nothing but endless training. Therese speculated that it was a sign of peace, and Clara added that peace itself was something to be thankful for. Still proud of their growth, Sven declared that they had grown much stronger and that he was craving something real, something with excitement. Before anyone could respond, Blake sensed something. His eyes lifted to the sky with sudden seriousness. Sven, surprised by the change in his expression, asked if Blake was angry and quickly apologized, thinking he had spoken out of turn. Blake remained focused and stated firmly that something was coming. Moments later, guards came rushing onto the grounds and delivered alarming news. A massive wave of miasma was approaching. Sven repeated the word with concern, but Blake and Lancelot exchanged glances, understanding the gravity of the situation without further discussion. The two men floated into the air using their magic and surveyed the city below. What they saw shocked them. Thick, unnatural miasma had begun to engulf the royal capital. Citizens panicked at the sight, unable to comprehend what was unfolding. One mother pulled her child to safety, but the child tripped, and the mother shielded him with her body as the miasma drew closer. Just as it was about to reach them, a bright blue light appeared, forming a shield around them. The same radiant power surged to the center of the capital and expanded outward. A massive barrier materialized, encircling the entire city and halting the miasma in its tracks. Citizens stared upward in disbelief. Lancelot, stunned, realized the miasma was no longer advancing. Blake informed him that he had erected a barrier around the royal capital to contain the miasma. Lancelot acknowledged that Blake had just saved the city and asked how long he could maintain it. Blake replied that he could likely sustain it for several months, which astonished Lancelot further. Blake explained that he hadn't used a magic-infused circle and that there had been no time to construct a wide-area formula. Before they could discuss further, an explosion shook the capital. Fire erupted in the streets, and rogue magicians appeared, launching attacks on the citizens. Lancelot questioned if this was a civil war, then quickly instructed Blake to maintain the barrier while he led the knights into the city. He ordered all units to move to their designated zones and descended toward the chaos, questioning whether this was an invasion or a rebellion. Elsewhere, the three young mages dashed into the streets, trying to understand the situation. They came upon a fire magician preparing to incinerate a civilian. Lancelot arrived just in time, using his wind magic to cleave the attacker in half. Without hesitation, he ordered the knights to prioritize civilian rescue. The royal knights engaged the rogue magicians, doing everything they could to defend the people. Sven, Therese, and Clara assisted with evacuation efforts. As they guided citizens to safety, two fire magicians identified them and moved to eliminate them. Fireballs were hurled toward them, but they managed to evade. The magicians shouted at them not to dodge, but the students continued to avoid each strike. Therese responded with bold defiance, confident they wouldn't be hit so easily. Clara supported her teammates from behind, enhancing their speed and magic. Seizing the opportunity, Sven and Therese launched a coordinated attack. Sven's fire and Therese's dark power struck the enemy, burning and slicing them down instantly. Therese declared proudly that these enemies were nothing compared to Blake's training. Clara, watching them, was reminded of the time they had been chased by level 3 monsters during training and thought she was going to die back then. Before they could catch their breath, more magicians surrounded them. Sven asked how many more were out there, and Therese responded that it seemed they had no choice but to keep fighting. Sven attacked first, hurling fire at the advancing foes. Therese followed with a burst of dark magic, causing an explosive chain reaction, while Clara enhanced their strength from behind. In the middle of the chaos, a small child was walking alone, crying and paralyzed by fear. Clara spotted the child just as a magician took aim. A fireball was sent directly at him. Without thinking, Clara sprinted forward and threw herself in front of the child. Therese screamed her name as flames exploded around them. The smoke hung heavily in the air. Sven and Therese stood frozen, unable to move, fearing the worst. But when the smoke cleared, Clara was unharmed, holding the child in her arms. A glowing barrier had formed around them just in time. Clara looked up, realizing what had protected her. All around the city, similar barriers began forming, each surrounding a citizen. Confused murmurs spread among the people. Lancelot looked upward, then back at the citizens, each now protected by individual barriers. He called out to Blake, asking if he had put one for every single person. Therese, filled with rage, immediately released her magic power toward the magician who had attacked Clara. Her blade-like energy tore through the air and struck with precision, slashing the enemy down instantly. With the threat eliminated, she and Sven rushed to Clara's side, both visibly worried and asking if she was all right. Clara, still holding the child she had protected, explained that Blake's barrier had shielded them. Therese expressed relief, while Sven looked around and noted that Blake wasn't anywhere nearby. Clara suggested that he might be casting the barrier from a distance. She then pointed to the people around them. Sven and Therese turned to look, and were shocked. Barriers were visibly surrounding other civilians as well. Therese, unable to contain her amazement, speculated if the barriers could be protecting every single person in the capital. Sven shouted that it was absolutely insane. Clara smiled quietly, confirming to herself once again that Blake was truly an extraordinary person. Meanwhile, Lancelot and his team were still engaged in battle against the rebel magicians. He shouted to his squad that the barrier protecting them was Blake's doing and urged them to make the most of it. One of the knights called back, warning that the rebel army's numbers were too great and that the royal family would soon be in danger at this rate. Lancelot asked if there were any spare troops available from the Magic Corps, but the response was negative. Realizing the difficult choice ahead, Lancelot understood that if they left their current position, civilians would be left vulnerable. Yet reaching the castle would take several minutes. With clenched teeth, Lancelot gave the order to entrust the defense of the castle to the Knight Corps. The announcement shocked those around him. One of the knights reminded him that the knights alone wouldn't be enough. Lancelot replied that Blake would provide support, and the knight acknowledged the command. That knight then smiled quietly, realizing Lancelot could have gone back himself, yet chose not to. It left him wondering if that decision was proof of just how much Lancelot trusted Blake. All the while, Lancelot continued cutting through rebel magicians, fully counting on Blake to hold the barrier. At the castle, the knights had gathered and were holding the gates with all their strength. The knight commander barked orders, telling his men not to let the bandits through. However, a fire magician among the rebels aimed his spell at the sky and exploded the gate into fragments. The commander was taken aback as the enemy magicians surged forward, rushing toward the castle interior. Just as they were about to breach the entrance, a barrier wall rose before them, halting their advance. In disbelief, the magicians shouted out, asking if this was the work of the barrier mage. Before they could regroup, a sword cleaved through them from behind. The knight commander had eliminated them all in one sweep. He glanced upward and quietly thanked Blake for the barrier, though Blake remained silent, his attention fixed entirely on maintaining the citywide defense. At that moment, a group of rebel magicians unleashed their combined magic in Blake's direction. As the spells neared, he calmly raised his arms. One hand blocked a surge of flames, the other deflected thunder magic. Simultaneously, he generated a massive barrier in front of him, intercepting the attacks entirely. Unbeknownst to him, a giant stone hand had formed behind him, and in a swift motion, it grabbed his ankle and slammed him to the ground. Despite the impact, Blake stood up again without a single injury or scratch. A figure stepped forward, commenting on his unscathed condition. It was Gunther, accompanied by several rebel magicians. Blake questioned whether Gunther was behind the rebellion. In response, Gunther, seething with anger, demanded to know how Blake dared to speak so casually to a high-ranking nobleman. He declared his intent to kill him, though the intensity of his own emotions left him breathless. Gunther straightened his posture and adjusted his coat, regaining a composed demeanor. He admitted that he had lost his composure, but reminded himself that a nobleman must always act like a gentleman. Blake asked how Gunther had escaped from prison. Gunther replied that he still had loyal supporters. When Blake asked what he meant by that, Gunther dismissed the need for further discussion, stating that Blake would die there anyway. Despite that, Blake persisted in questioning Gunther's motives. Gunther released a dark aura as his emotions boiled over. He shouted that it was all Blake's fault, calling him trash, a maggot, and a bastard. Gunther went on, declaring that he had been demoted and exiled to the Borderlands, while a mere barrier mage like Blake had taken Alice away from him. In his fury, he blamed Blake entirely for his downfall. Blake listened to Gunther's accusations and calmly suggested that perhaps it was simply karma. The remark stunned Gunther. Blake explained that if Gunther had lived with sincerity and purpose, he wouldn't be in his current situation. The words visibly agitated Gunther, who was further angered when Blake added that Alice had said she was never his lover. Though it intensified Gunther's fury, Blake continued, advising him to stop blaming others for his own failures. That final comment caused Gunther to snap. In a frenzied scream, he vowed to burn Blake to death. He released a powerful and dark surge of magic, shouting that no matter how strong Blake was, casting barriers across the entire royal capital and the castle was impossible for one man. He claimed that he and the rebel magicians were seasoned fighters, and that this would be the end. Gunther, grinning with satisfaction, ordered all the rebel magicians to attack together. They complied without hesitation, unleashing their combined magical power at Blake in a single overwhelming assault. Gunther screamed in rage and triumph, declaring that the barrier mage would finally die. He calmly extended his hand forward, forming a barrier that blocked every magical attack coming toward him. Gunther, frustrated, released more of his own magic and ordered the others to continue the assault. Despite their efforts, the attacks were still not enough to break through the barrier. Rebel magicians then appeared behind him. Gunther commanded them to strike from the rear and finish him off. They obeyed, casting spells at his back, while additional attacks came from both sides. Surrounded on all fronts, he extended both arms forward and backward, forming a spherical barrier that enclosed him completely and intercepted the coordinated strikes. However, under the pressure of sustained flame magic, a crack appeared in the barrier. The barrier began to splinter and then shattered entirely, leaving him momentarily stunned. He had not expected it to break. Gunther, seeing the opening, urged his followers to attack again. The magicians launched another barrage of magic in unison. This time, he waited until the attacks were nearly upon him, then evaded every single strike with precise movements. He maneuvered through the final blast with ease, leaving the magicians stunned that he had dodged everything once again. Gunther, unwilling to give up, shouted that it didn't matter and ordered them to keep firing. Once more, an all-out attack was launched in his direction. He responded by reinforcing his feet with barrier energy, using it to propel himself high into the air to avoid the blast. Gunther laughed, calling him a fool and claiming there was nowhere to run. The enemy magicians responded with another synchronized attack, sending waves of destructive magic toward him mid-air. He softened a barrier around his palm, shaping it into a spear-like arrow, while his other hand formed a square barrier. Using the barrier, he propelled himself forward and pierced through the flame. He escaped the attack before it detonated, though he sustained light burns and injuries. Gunther grinned upon seeing his condition and mockingly asked if he was finished already. Gunther claimed that he was spreading himself too thin by deploying barriers across the capital, and that those worthless citizens would be the reason for his downfall. Remaining composed, he responded that Gunther was wrong. The unexpected response briefly silenced Gunther's manic energy. He then explained that it was thanks to everyone else that he could continue fighting. Gunther, irritated by the sentiment, accused him of spouting righteous nonsense. Gunther and the remaining magicians resumed their assault with a flood of magic. He narrowly dodged the incoming spells before they exploded across the battlefield. Gunther, incredulous, could not believe he was still standing. Blake, while in the air, glared down at Gunther before launching himself forward at high speed. He tore through the rebel magicians' formation, effortlessly breaking their line. Gunther and the few remaining followers were stunned. One of the rebels behind Gunther collapsed suddenly, causing Gunther to whirl around in panic, demanding to know what had just happened. Blake calmly explained that it was a mobile barrier technique, then elaborated that barrier magic had many variations: offensive, defensive, and even healing. Before Gunther could react, he demonstrated by instantly healing himself on the spot. Gunther, infuriated, shouted that it was absurd and questioned how barrier magic could heal, declaring that only holy magic had such properties. He accused the technique of being unnatural and protested that barrier techniques were meant solely for defense. When he asked how it was possible, Blake simply stated that it was likely the result of training hard. This response pushed Gunther further into anger. He accused Blake of mocking him. With only 2 rebel magicians remaining, Gunther prepared to attack. Before any spells could be cast, Blake darted forward with lightning speed and struck down the 2 rebels at Gunther's side. Gunther looks back in disbelief, seeing his final allies unconscious. He informed Gunther that he was now the last one remaining, and then disappeared. In the blink of an eye, he reappeared behind Gunther and asked why he wouldn't surrender. Gunther began to laugh, then reached into his pocket and retrieved a hidden item. He revealed a purple stone, his trump card, and placed it into his mouth, consuming it. The stone's energy spread rapidly through his body, turning his veins a glowing violet. Gunther proclaimed his newfound invincibility, stating that the stone had been meant for a moment when he would be alone with Alice. He boasted that even the hero would submit to him with this power. Blake, still composed, simply said that he wouldn't allow it. Gunther began casting a massive dark energy, shouting that he should stop pretending to be Alice's protector. He hurled the magic at Blake and ridiculed him as an old man. Blake attempted to raise a barrier in response. However, the enhanced spell shattered the defense instantly, and a massive explosion followed, echoing across the battlefield.